Hello everyone. I know many of you are listening to this right now while the rest of the world has gone quiet. Maybe the lights are off. Maybe there's a fan running somewhere in the background, or rain tapping softly against your window. Maybe you have your blanket pulled up just a little higher than usual, not because you're cold, but because something about the night makes you want to feel covered. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. What city? What country? What little corner of the world you're in? I always love reading those. There's something comforting about knowing that people all over the world are here, in the dark together. And if you're new here, please like and subscribe. It means more than you know. Get comfortable, take a breath, and let's talk about Fort Worth. There is a specific kind of quiet that belongs to a Texas summer night. Anyone who has spent time in that part of the country knows exactly what I mean. It is not the cool, forgiving quiet of the mountains. It is not the breezy, salt-scented quiet of the coast. Texas summer quiet is thick, it is heavy. The air sits on your skin like something warm and alive. Even at midnight and at 2 in the morning, the temperature barely drops. Crickets fill every silence. The stars above the flatlands are enormous and indifferent. And the streets of a working-class neighborhood in Fort Worth, lined with modest brick homes, with station wagons parked in cracked concrete driveways, with chain-link fences separating one small yard from the next. Those streets have a particular stillness like feels, on most nights, like peace. Fort Worth in the 1970s was a city caught between two worlds. It was growing. The population was pushing upward. The suburbs were expanding outward. And the oil money that had long defined Texas culture was flowing through the city's veins in new and complicated ways. Downtown had its glass buildings and its commerce. But the neighborhoods, the real neighborhoods, the ones where ordinary families lived ordinary lives, those were places built on something simpler. On Friday night football games. On neighbors who knew your name. On children who played outside until the streetlights came on and mothers called them in for dinner. It was in one of these neighborhoods, in the summer of 1974, that 3 teenagers lived the kinds of lives that felt, from the outside, like exactly what a young life in America was supposed to look like. Their names were Thomas Simmons, Charles Buckingham, and Michael Shirley. 3 boys, 3 families, 3 futures that were just beginning to take shape. And then, one night in July, all 3 of them disappeared, not one at a time. Not across different weeks or different months. All 3 of them. Together. What followed was one of the most heartbreaking, most frustrating, and most haunting investigations in the history of Fort Worth, Texas. A case that stretched across years, then decades. A case that left families without answers, law enforcement without resolution, and a community with a wound that never quite closed. This is the story of the Fort Worth missing trio. And tonight we are going to go through every detail. Thomas Simmons was 16 years old in the summer of 1974, and if you had known him, really known him, the way his family knew him, you would have understood almost immediately why people gravitated toward him. He was not the loudest person in the room. He was not the one performing for attention or trying to dominate the conversation. Thomas was something rarer than that. He was the kind of person who made you feel, simply by being in his presence, like you were exactly where you were supposed to be. His mother, Patricia Simmons, described him in interviews given years after his disappearance as a boy who had his father's steady hands and his grandmother's sense of humor. He was the kind of kid who would fix something around the house without being asked, who would notice when his younger sister was upset before she said a single word about it, who would sit with the family's old dog on the back porch for hours, not doing anything in particular, just being present. Thomas was of medium height, with dark hair that he wore slightly longer than his father would have preferred, because it was 1974, and that was simply what boys did with their hair. He had a gap between his 2 front teeth that showed up in every photograph, because Thomas almost always smiled in photographs. He worked part-time at a hardware store near his house, 3 afternoons a week after school and 1 weekend day, and he had been saving his money with a seriousness that was unusual for a teenager. He wanted a car, not a flashy car, just something that ran. something that would give him the freedom that every 16-year-old boy in the history of the world has understood on a cellular level. He had one more year of high school left. He had talked, in vague but earnest terms, about maybe taking some courses at the community college after graduation. He wasn't sure yet what direction he wanted to go. His mother said he sometimes talked about learning a trade, maybe electrical work or HVAC, something practical, something that would always be needed. His father thought maybe he'd end up in construction, because Thomas liked working with his hands and he liked being outdoors. Whatever was going to happen, whatever direction Thomas Simmons's life was going to take, it was going to be something good. That much felt certain to everyone who knew him. He had a group of close friends, as most 16-year-old boys do, but the two he was closest to were Charles Buckingham and Michael Shirley. The three of them had known each other since middle school, had grown up within a few blocks of each other, had passed through the strange and turbulent years of early adolescence side by side in the way that only very close friends can. By the summer of 1974, they were inseparable in the easy, unspoken way of people who have simply decided without any formal declaration that they belong to the same world. Charles Buckingham was also 16, and he was, by most accounts, the most outgoing of the three. Where Thomas was steady and quiet, Charles was animated, expressive. He talked with his hands. He had opinions about everything and was not shy about sharing them. Though the people who knew him best were quick to point out that his opinions were almost always delivered with a grin, because Charles didn't take himself too seriously. He could argue with you about something for 20 minutes, and then laugh about it the moment the argument was over. Because for Charles, the conversation was never really about winning. It was about the talking. It was about the connection. He was tall for his age, already close to 6 feet, with sandy brown hair and a habit of squinting slightly when he was thinking about something, as if he were trying to read small print on a distant wall. His younger brother Danny, who was 11 in the summer of 1974, later recalled that Charles would sometimes spend entire Saturday mornings building model cars at the kitchen table, completely absorbed, not saying a word, which was the closest Charles Buckingham ever got to silence. Charles was not a straight-A student, but he wasn't a bad student either. He was the kind of kid who paid attention when something interested him, and drifted when it didn't, which is a perfectly ordinary way to be at 16, and does not tell you anything particularly meaningful about a person's character. What it did tell you was that Charles Buckingham was a person who was guided by what genuinely interested him, not by what he thought was expected. What interested him most, that summer, was music. He had been teaching himself guitar for about a year, using a second-hand acoustic his father had picked up at a garage sale, and while he was not yet particularly good at it, he was enthusiastic in a way that suggested he eventually would be. He played the same 3 chords over and over in his bedroom, working through songs he'd heard on the radio, and his mother had long since stopped asking him to keep it down because the sound of it, even badly played, made the house feel full in a way she liked. He and Thomas Simmons had met in 7th grade, in a PE class where they had been assigned to the same team, and had spent an entire volleyball unit losing badly together. By the end of that semester they were friends. Michael Shirley came later, in 8th grade when he transferred to their school from across town. Michael Shirley was the youngest of the 3 by a matter of months. Though he would have told you that the distinction was completely meaningless. He was born in April of 1958, which made him still 15 for a few weeks that summer before turning 16 in late July. He was the smallest of the 3 physically, compact and quick, moving, with dark eyes that were always taking things in. People who met Michael for the first time sometimes got the impression that he was shy, because he didn't offer information about himself immediately. Didn't rush to fill silence with words the way Charles did. But the people who knew him understood that what looked like shyness was actually something else entirely. It was attention. Michael Shirley was paying close attention to everything around him. He was, by the accounts of his family and teachers, exceptionally perceptive. His 6th grade teacher had written in a report that Michael had a quality of observation that was unusual for his age, a way of noticing things that other children missed. His mother, Donna Shirley, remembered an incident when Michael was about 9 years old. The family had been visiting relatives, and on the drive home Michael had quietly told his mother that something seemed wrong with one of the aunts at the gathering. He couldn't explain what exactly, just that her smile looked tired in a way that felt different from tired. 2 weeks later, the aunt was diagnosed with an illness she had been concealing from the family for months. That kind of perception doesn't go away as a person grows up. In Michael Shirley, it seemed to deepen. By 16, he was the one in the group who noticed when something felt off, who would quietly point out to Thomas or Charles that a situation didn't seem right, that they should probably leave, that something in a room had shifted. The terrible irony of that particular quality, in light of what would happen in July of 1974, is something that Michael's mother has never been able to fully set aside, even decades later. Even after everything, Michael liked drawing. He kept a sketchbook that he carried almost everywhere, filling it with drawings of things he saw: buildings, street scenes, the faces of people on buses, the view from his bedroom window at different times of day. He wasn't pursuing art seriously, not in the way a person pursues something they intend to make a career of. It was more like a private language he kept for himself, a way of processing what he saw. He and Charles and Thomas had settled by that summer into the kind of comfortable routine that feels, when you are living it, like it will simply go on forever. They rode bikes. They went to the public pool. They hung around the neighborhood in that aimless way that teenagers do, not really going anywhere in particular, just moving through the world together, talking about nothing and everything. They were at the age when the future is simultaneously very close and completely abstract, close enough to see the shape of it, abstract enough that it doesn't feel quite real yet. In July of 1974, all three of them had their whole lives ahead of them. And then they were gone. To understand what happened, or rather, to understand the long and devastating effort to understand what happened, you have to start with the evening of July 12, 1974. It was a Friday. The temperature in Fort Worth that day had reached 98 degrees by early afternoon and had not dropped significantly by the time the sun went down. The kind of heat that makes the inside of a car feel like the inside of an oven, that makes the sidewalk shimmer, that makes everyone move a little more slowly than they normally would, conserving energy, waiting for relief that doesn't quite come. Thomas Simmons had spent most of that afternoon at home, helping his father with some work in the backyard. They had been trying to repair a section of fence that had been leaning badly for weeks. By early evening, the fence was fixed. Thomas had showered, changed into a light shirt and jeans, and eaten dinner with his family. His mother remembered that dinner clearly, the way you remember the ordinary things that come just for extraordinary disruption. They had hamburgers. His younger sister had complained about something at the table. She couldn't later remember what. Thomas had made a joke about it that made everyone laugh, including the sister. After dinner, around 7 o'clock, Thomas told his parents he was going to meet up with Charles and Michael. This was not unusual. This was, in fact, the most ordinary thing in the world. He told them he'd be home by midnight, a curfew that he was, by all accounts, generally reliable about keeping. His mother said she asked him where they were going, and he said they were just going to hang out, maybe walk around, maybe end up at someone's house. She told him to be careful. He said he would. He went out the back door. That was the last time Patricia Simmons saw her son. A few blocks away, Charles Buckingham had a similar evening. He had been at home most of the day, practicing his guitar in his room, enduring the gentle teasing of his younger brother Danny, watching television with his parents for a while in the late afternoon. By early evening, he was restless in the way teenagers get restless on summer Friday nights. That particular energy that has nowhere else to go except out the door and into the neighborhood. He told his parents he was going to meet Thomas and Michael. His father told him to have a good time. His mother reminded him about the midnight curfew. Charles gave some version of a teenage yes, I know, and headed out. Michael Shirley left his house at approximately the same time, heading in the direction of the small park 2 blocks from his house. a place that served as a common meeting point for the three boys, a patch of grass with a few benches, and a rusted basketball hoop, where they often gathered before deciding where to go from there. All three of them were last seen in the general vicinity of their neighborhood by early evening on July 12, 1974. Multiple neighbors recalled seeing them that evening, two of them together on bikes, or all three of them walking, or one of them alone, heading in a particular direction. The sightings are consistent up to a point a few minutes before 8 o'clock that evening. The three boys were seen together on a street approximately 4 blocks from Michael Shirley's house, heading east. After that, nothing. No confirmed sightings. No witnesses who came forward to say they saw them later that night. No indication of where they went, what they did, or who they may have encountered. They simply walked east on a summer Friday evening in Fort Worth, Texas, and they did not come home. The families did not immediately panic. This matters, and it's worth sitting with for a moment, because it speaks to something true about the way human beings process the beginning of catastrophe. When something terrible is just starting to happen, before the shape of it has revealed itself, the mind reaches almost reflexively for the ordinary explanation. The benign one. The one that doesn't require the world to be different from what you thought it was. Patricia Simmons waited until midnight. When Thomas didn't come home, she assumed he was at someone's house and had lost track of time. She called the Buckingham house. The phone rang several times before Charles's mother answered. She had also been waiting, also starting to feel something at the edge of her attention that she wasn't quite ready to name yet. Charles wasn't home either. They called the Shirley house. Donna Shirley told them Michael wasn't home either. 3 mothers, 3 missing boys. One summer night that had gone on too long. Even then, the immediate assumption was not the worst one. Teenagers lost track of time. Teenagers ended up at parties they hadn't mentioned. Teenagers sometimes made decisions that their parents wouldn't have approved of and stayed out later than they were supposed to. This was known. This was the territory of having teenage children. The 3 women decided to wait a little longer, to give it until 1, maybe 2 in the morning, to see if the boys came home on their own. They didn't. By 2 in the morning on July 13, 1974, all 3 families were awake. Calls had been made to friends of the boys, people who might know where they had gone, who had been planning to see. No one knew anything. Or rather, no one who was reached that night knew anything that was useful. The boys had been seen earlier in the evening, had been expected to show up at various places, had not shown up. That was all anyone could say. The fathers got in cars and drove through the neighborhood. They drove to the places the boys were known to go. The park, the convenience store on the corner, the empty lot behind the school where teenagers sometimes gathered in the evenings. Nothing, no sign of them. Just the quiet, thick Texas night, the streets empty now. The houses dark behind their windows. By morning, all 3 families had made the decision to call the police. The Fort Worth Police Department received the missing persons reports for Thomas Simmons, Charles Buckingham, and Michael Shirley on the morning of July 13, 1974. 3 separate reports filed by 3 separate families, but immediately understood by the officers who took the calls to be part of the same situation. 3 teenage boys, all from the same neighborhood, all missing since the previous evening. All friends, all last seen together. The initial police response was, and this is something that will become significant as the story develops, measured. Careful, not dismissive, but not immediately alarmed in the way that the families needed it to be. In 1974, police departments across the country operated under a set of assumptions about missing teenagers that would, in the decades that followed, be substantially revised. The working assumption, particularly for teenage boys, was that they had run away, that they had made some impulsive decision, a fight with parents, a desire for adventure, a girl somewhere, some combination of the above, and that they would most likely return on their own within a few days. This assumption was understandable. It was, statistically, often correct. Teenagers ran away all the time. The vast majority came back. In 1974, there was not yet the infrastructure, the national databases, the Amber Alert systems, the coordinated multi-agency response protocols that now exist to handle exactly these situations. a missing teenager in 1974, at least initially as a local matter with local resources, operating on local assumptions. But there were aspects of this case that should have, from the very beginning, signaled something different. 3 boys all from the same neighborhood, all close friends, all missing on the same night. That pattern doesn't fit the runaway explanation in any comfortable way. Teenagers who run away generally run away alone, or occasionally in pairs, and generally after some identifiable precipitating event. There was no such event here. None of the 3 boys had had significant arguments with their parents recently. None of them had given any indication of wanting to leave. By every account from everyone who knew them, all 3 had been in good spirits in the days aiding up to their disappearance. They had plans. Michael Shirley had been talking about wanting to go to the state fair when it came through later that summer. Thomas Simmons had been looking at a used car in a neighbor's driveway with increasing interest. Charles Buckingham had learned a new chord on his guitar and was deeply pleased with himself about it. These were not boys who were planning to disappear. The family said this to the police. They said it clearly and they said it repeatedly. And to the police's credit, the investigation did begin. Door-to-door inquiries in the neighborhood, conversations with friends and classmates of the boys, a search of the immediate area. But the urgency that the families felt, that electric, stomach-dropping certainty that something was very wrong, was not matched by what they experienced from law enforcement in those first critical days. This is a grief that will run beneath the surface of this entire story, right up to the present day. The grief of families who knew from the beginning that their boys had not simply wandered away, and who spent years feeling that the people with the authority and resources to find them did not fully share their certainty. The neighborhood where all 3 boys lived sat on the west side of Fort Worth, in an area that was solidly working class. The kind of community built by people who had come to the city for factory work or trades work, who had put down roots, who had put down lives in the small, incremental, unglamorous way that most lives are actually built. It was not a neighborhood with a lot of crime. It was not a neighborhood where parents typically worried about their children walking a few blocks to meet their friends on a summer evening. It was exactly the kind of place where, in 1974, a boy could tell his mother he was going out, and she would say be careful and mean it as a kind of ritual, not as a genuine expression of fear. The streets in that area ran mostly east, west, flat and wide the way Texas streets tend to be. There were no hills, no dramatic geographical features to block the view in any direction. You could stand at one end of many of those streets and see a very long way, which made it all the more disorienting, in the days after the boys disappeared, that no one could establish where they had gone. 4 blocks east of Michael Shirley's house and then nothing. That was the boundary of the known world, as far as this case was concerned. In the days that followed July 12th, the families of Thomas Simmons, Charles Buckingham, and Michael Shirley did what families in their position do. They made flyers. They distributed them through the neighborhood, to local businesses, to churches. They organized their own search parties. Groups of neighbors and relatives walking through vacant lots and along creek beds and through the patches of scrubland that existed in various places around the city. They called radio stations and asked them to put out appeals for information. They did everything within their power to find their boys, because they understood, with a clarity that only love can produce, that waiting was not an option. The days turned into a week. The week turned into 2. No sign of the boys appeared. No credible information came in. The trail, which had been thin to begin with, became thinner, and then something changed. It was in the 3rd week after the disappearance, on a Tuesday morning in late July, that the first significant piece of information reached the Fort Worth Police Department. It came in the form of a phone call from a man who lived approximately 6 miles east of the neighborhood where the boys had last been seen. The man, whose name has been withheld from public records at his request, for reasons that will become clear, said that he had seen something on the night of July 12th that he hadn't thought much of at the time, but that had been bothering him ever since he heard about the missing boys. He had been driving east on a major road, that cut through that part of the city. Sometime between 8 and 9 o'clock in the evening, he had stopped at a traffic light, and in the intersection to his right, he had seen three boys, teenagers, he thought, he couldn't be sure, getting into a large vehicle. A truck, he thought, or maybe a van. It was dark already, or close to dark, and the light on that particular corner wasn't good. He couldn't tell the color of the vehicle with confidence. He couldn't describe the driver. What he remembered was that appeared to know the person driving. There was no hesitation, no sense of coercion that he could detect from where he was sitting. They just got in, and the vehicle drove away. He hadn't thought much of it that night, because why would he? Three teenagers getting into a vehicle is not, under most circumstances, an alarming thing to witness. But 3 weeks later, with the missing boys' faces on flyers in every shop window in the area, he could not stop thinking about what he had seen. His description of the boys matched Thomas Simmons, Charles Buckingham, and Michael Shirley in general terms. Their approximate heights, their builds, their ages. He could not be more specific than that. The investigative significance of this call was substantial. It moved the case from a disappearance that might have involved the boys going somewhere on their own to a disappearance that now had a vehicle in it. A driver. Another person. Someone who, at minimum, had been the last known person to see all three boys alive. And it moved the case, inexorably, terribly, in the direction that the families had already been privately fearing. This was not a runaway situation. Something had happened to their boys, something involving someone else. That realization, when it fully settled, when law enforcement's posture shifted and the investigation expanded, and the word that no family ever wants to hear began to appear in the conversations, changed everything. Changed it for the families in ways that are almost impossible to describe to anyone who has not experienced it. Because there is a particular kind of grief that belongs to the moment, when hope and horror become the same thing. When you want desperately to know what happened, and you are terrified of knowing, both at the same time. Patricia Simmons said later that she had known, in her body if not in her mind, from the second or third day after Thomas disappeared. Known in the way that a mother knows things. The way that love sometimes operates below the level of conscious thought. She had known, and she had spent weeks trying not to know, trying to hold on to the version of events where her son was somewhere. Confused, maybe scared, but alive. Donna Shirley said something similar. She described the period between the disappearance and the moment when investigators began speaking to the families with a different tone, a different set of implicit messages, as a period of suspended time. Days that felt like they weren't quite real, like she was waiting for the world to resume its normal operation, and it simply refused. Charles Buckingham's mother had a breakdown in early August. Her sister came to stay with the family. Danny, the 11-year-old younger brother, later recalled spending those weeks being very quiet around the house, understanding without being told that something enormous and terrible was happening, not fully understanding what it was. 3 families in 3 houses in a Fort Worth neighborhood, all of them living inside the same nightmare, all of them waiting. The investigation in the weeks following the phone call about the vehicle took on a different shape. Detectives began canvassing the area around the intersection, where the witness had reported seeing the boys getting into a vehicle. They spoke to businesses in the area, to residents who lived nearby, to anyone who might have been in the vicinity that evening and might have seen something. Several additional witnesses came forward. Not many, and not with the kind of precise detail that investigators needed, but enough to build a slightly fuller picture. A woman who lived near the intersection remembered seeing a dark-colored truck. She was fairly certain it was a truck, parked on the street near her house sometime that evening. She couldn't say exactly when. She hadn't paid it much attention. A man who had been walking his dog that night remembered seeing teenagers in the general area. He thought there might have been 2 other boys in addition to the ones he saw, but he wasn't sure. He hadn't seen a vehicle. The picture that emerged from all of this testimony was partial, fragmentary, maddeningly incomplete. There was a vehicle. There may have been a driver who was known to the boys, or at least not feared by them. And after they got into that vehicle, they vanished. Investigators began to look at who in the boys' lives might have had access to such a vehicle. Friends of the family, older teenagers from the neighborhood, adults who had some connection to the three boys. It was a wide net, and it caught a great many people who needed to be spoken to and cleared, and the work of it was slow and, in those first weeks and months, produced nothing definitive. But something was building. Beneath the surface of the official investigation, in the testimony of witnesses, in the geography of where the boys had last been seen, in the small and seemingly inconsequential details that investigators were collecting and cataloging, something was beginning to take shape. And in the months that followed, that shape would become clearer. And it would be much darker than anyone had allowed themselves to imagine. By the time autumn arrived in Fort Worth, bringing with it a slight cooling of the brutal summer heat and the beginning of the new school year, the absence of Thomas Simmons, Charles Buckingham, and Michael Shirley had settled into the life of the neighborhood in the way that terrible things sometimes do. It was present everywhere, in the way that people talked in lowered voices when certain subjects came up, in the way that parents were a little quicker to answer the door when their children were expected home, in the small alterations of behavior that a community makes when something has happened that it cannot fully process. The school year began without them. Their friends sat in classes where their seats were empty. Teachers navigated the semester with a kind of careful gentleness, aware that the absence was felt by their students in ways that didn't always have words. The three families sent their other children back to school, went about the business of daily life because daily life has to be gone about regardless of what has happened, and waited. The Fort Worth Police Department's investigation continued. It would continue for a long time. It would turn in many directions, pursue many leads, speak to many people. And it would do so against a backdrop of growing family frustration and growing public attention. Because a story like this, 3 boys, 1 neighborhood, 1 summer night gone, has a way of staying in the consciousness of a community. The full weight of what happened on July 12, 1974, would take years to even begin to be understood. And even today, the understanding remains incomplete. But we are going to go as far into it as we can. Because Thomas Simmons and Charles Buckingham and Michael Shirley deserve to have their story told. They deserve to be remembered not as a cold case, not as a statistic, not as a footnote in a police file somewhere, but as the real specific, irreplaceable people they were. 3 boys in a Fort Worth neighborhood on a summer evening, heading east, and everything that came after. The fall of 1974 moved Fort Worth the way fall moves through most of Texas, slowly, reluctantly, summer refusing to fully release its grip until well into October. The leaves didn't turn the way they do in other parts of the country. The change was subtler. A slight drop in temperature at night. A shift in the quality of the light in the late afternoon. A sense that the world was moving from one thing to another. Even if you couldn't quite point to the exact moment it happened. For the families of Thomas Simmons, Charles Buckingham, and Michael Shirley, the arrival of autumn meant something specific and terrible. It meant that their boys had been missing for 3 months. It meant that the summer, the season in which they had disappeared, the season that had framed every conversation about them, every search, every phone call to the police department was over. And yet the boys were still gone. The world had continued without them and they had not come back to it. Patricia Simmons later said that the arrival of September was one of the hardest moments of those early months. Because September meant school, and school meant a calendar. And the calendar meant that time was passing in ways that were marked and measurable, ways that the mind could not avoid. She knew, sitting in her house on the morning of the first day of school, exactly how many days it had been since Thomas walked out the back door. She had been counting. She had not been able to stop counting. The Fort Worth Police Department, meanwhile, had restructured its approach to the case. By September, it had become clear to detectives assigned to the investigation that the initial framework, the runaway assumption, the local matter posture, was not going to serve them. 3 boys from the same neighborhood, gone on the same night, with a witness who had placed all 3 of them in a vehicle with an unknown driver. This was not a runaway situation. This was something else. Something that required a different level of attention and a different set of investigative tools. The detective who took primary responsibility for the case in the fall of 1974 was a man named Roy Calvert. He had been with the Fort Worth Police Department for 11 years at that point, had worked homicide for the last 5, and had a reputation among his colleagues for 2 specific qualities: patience and stubbornness. He was the kind of investigator who kept files on his desk long after other people would have filed them away, who circled back to witnesses months after the initial conversation, who held on to the small and seemingly irrelevant details because he had learned, over the course of his career, that the small details had a way of eventually becoming the significant ones. Roy Calvert looked at the Fort Worth missing trio case and saw something that troubled him deeply. Not just the disappearance itself, not just the tragedy of 3 young boys gone from their families, but something in the shape of it, the way it had happened, the speed of it, the completeness of it. 3 boys in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, and not a single person had seen anything useful after approximately 8 o'clock on the evening of July 12th. That kind of invisibility doesn't happen by accident. That kind of invisibility requires planning. He started, as good investigators always start, with the geography. He spent several days in the neighborhood, walking the streets the boys would have walked. Standing at the intersection where the witness had reported seeing them get into a vehicle, looking at the surrounding area with the deliberate attention that his job required, 6 miles east of where the boys lived. That was a significant distance to have traveled on foot on a summer evening in that heat. It suggested, though it did not prove, that the boys had not simply walked from their neighborhood to that intersection. They had been moving, purposefully, toward something or someone, or they had been picked up earlier and brought to that location. The intersection itself sat on a road that connected residential Fort Worth to several other parts of the city, areas that included, among other things, a stretch of commercial properties, some light industrial buildings, and further east, a more rural corridor where the city gradually gave way to the flat, scrubby landscape that characterized that part of North Texas. It was a road that someone who wanted to move through the city without drawing attention might choose. Not a highway, not a major boulevard, but not a back alley either. A middle ground kind of road. Calvert had the area canvassed again more thoroughly than had been in July. He wanted to speak to every business owner on that stretch, every resident within a reasonable walking distance, anyone who had any reason to be in the area regularly, and might have noticed something that seemed, at the time, too ordinary to mention. This second canvass, conducted in September 1974, produced 3 new pieces of information. The first came from the owner of a repair shop about a quarter mile from the intersection. He remembered that on the evening of July 12th, he had been closing up the shop. It was around 8:30, he thought maybe a little before, when he noticed a truck parked on the shoulder of the road across from his property. He hadn't paid it much attention, because trucks parked on the shoulder of roads were not uncommon in that area. But he remembered it because it was there when he arrived to close up, and it was still there, in the same spot, when he drove away maybe 20 minutes later. A dark-colored truck. He thought it might have been dark blue or possibly dark green. A full-size truck, not a small one. He didn't notice anyone in or near during the time he was at the shop. The second piece of information came from a teenage girl who lived on a street adjacent to the main road, whose bedroom window looked toward the intersection. She had been in her room that evening, listening to the radio when she heard something outside. Not a crash, not a fight, nothing alarming, just voices. She looked out her window and saw in a fading evening light what she thought were 3 or 4 people near a vehicle at the far end of the street. She couldn't make out faces or details. She went back to her radio. She hadn't thought to mention it when the first round of canvassing happened in July, because it had seemed so completely unremarkable. It was only when investigators came back in September and asked specifically about the evening of July 12th that she connected what she had seen to the missing boys. The third piece came from a man who drove that road regularly for work. He remembered seeing a dark truck on the evening of July 12th. He was quite confident about the date because he had a delivery log that placed him on that road that evening. He had passed the truck going in the opposite direction. He saw in his rearview mirror what he thought was the truck pulling to the side of the road. He didn't see anyone get in or out. He kept driving. 3 witnesses, 3 different vantage points, 3 slightly different pieces of a picture, none of them conclusive, all of them pointing in the same direction. There had been a dark, colored truck on that road on the evening of July 12th. The boys had been seen in that area. The truck had been stationary, parked waiting, and then it was gone. Calvert began building a list of dark-colored trucks registered to owners in the Fort Worth area. In 1974, before the kind of computerized databases that now make this kind of inquiry almost instantaneous, this was slow, painstaking work. It meant going through physical records, cross-referencing registrations with addresses, building a list by hand. The list was long. Fort Worth was a working-class city, and dark-colored pickup trucks were among the most common vehicles on its roads. But Calvert was patient. That was, as his colleagues would have told you, the thing about Roy Calvert. He was just extraordinarily patient. He began narrowing the list using criteria that the witness description suggested. Full-size truck, dark color, possibly blue or green. No distinctive markings that any witness had mentioned. He cross-referenced the narrowed list with people who had any connection to the 3 boys, however tangential, however remote. People who knew the boys' families. People who lived in the neighborhood or in adjacent neighborhoods. People who worked at places the boys frequented. This process took weeks. Most of the people on the resulting list were easily cleared. They had solid alibis for the evening of July 12th. Or their vehicles didn't match the description closely enough. Or there was simply no credible connection to the boys that the investigation could establish. But there were a handful of names that Calvert kept coming back to. People he couldn't immediately clear. People whose connection to the neighborhood, or to the boys, or to the geography of the case, created questions he couldn't answer to his own satisfaction. One name in particular kept appearing at the edges of the investigation, in the peripheral vision of multiple pieces of testimony, not in the center, not in a way that could be pointed to as obviously significant. But there, persistently in that quiet and troubling way that some names have in investigations like this. A name that people mention without being prompted, in different contexts, in different conversations, as if he were simply a feature of the landscape of that time and place. The name was Gerald Howell. Gerald Howell was 34 years old in the summer of 1974. He had lived in the Fort Worth area for most of his adult life, having grown up in a small town about 60 miles to the west before coming to the city in his early 20s. He worked in the construction industry, not as a skilled tradesman, but in a laboring capacity, the kind of work that took him from job site to job site depending on where the contracts were. The work was irregular, which meant his income was irregular, which meant he lived in a way that was always slightly precarious, always slightly on the edge of some small financial crisis, though never so far over that edge that he attracted particular attention. He was a large man, over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders, with thick hands that bore the marks of years of physical work. People who knew him described him as quiet, not the warm, attentive quiet of Michael Shirley, but a different kind of quiet, an opaque kind, the kind that made it hard to know what was happening behind a person's eyes. He owned a dark blue full-size pickup truck. He had lived for approximately 2 years before the disappearance, in a rented house on a street on the eastern edge of the neighborhood where the 3 boys lived. He had moved out of house in early 1974, about 6 months before the disappearance, but his connection to the area remained. He still had acquaintances there, still came through the neighborhood from time to time. Several neighbors, when Calvert spoke to them, mentioned Howell's name not in response to direct questions about him, but in response to general questions about people who were around the neighborhood, people the boys might have known or encountered. He came up in the way that fixtures come up when you're asking about a place, naturally, without particular emphasis, just as part of the description of the world. Did the boys know Gerald Howell? That was a question Calvert needed to answer. He began asking carefully, and without telegraphing his interest, about whether Thomas Charles or Michael had had any contact with Howell. The answers he got were, as with so much in this case, frustratingly partial. One neighbor thought she had seen Thomas talking to Howell on the street at some point during the spring of 1974. But she wasn't certain. A friend of Charles's, when asked about older men in the neighborhood who sometimes interacted with the boys, mentioned Howell's name among a small group of others, without particular emphasis. Michael's mother, Donna Shirley, said that she knew of Gerald Howell. She had seen him in the neighborhood, but she could not say whether Michael had ever spoken with him directly. None of this was evidence. None of it was even close to evidence. But it was a pattern, and Calvert was a person who paid attention to patterns. He arranged to speak with Gerald Howell. The conversation took place in October 1974 at the Fort Worth Police Department. Howell came involuntarily. He had not been compelled, had not been summoned with any formal authority, had simply been asked if he would come in and speak to investigators about the missing boys. He agreed. He came in on a Thursday morning, sat down across from Calvert and another detective, and spoke for about 2 hours. What Roy Calvert observed during those 2 hours was, by his own later account, difficult to categorize precisely. Howell was cooperative. He answered questions. He said he had heard about the missing boys, of course. Everyone in that part of Fort Worth had heard, and he expressed what appeared to be appropriate concern. He acknowledged that he knew the neighborhood, that he had spent time there, that he might have had some interaction with teenagers from the area over the years, though he said he couldn't recall anything specific. He said that on the evening of July 12th, he had been at a bar on the other side of the city, a place he went to regularly, and that he had stayed there until closing time. He named several people who he said could confirm he had been there. Calvert noted several things during the interview. He noted that Howell was comfortable with silence in a way that was unusual for someone in his position. Most people, when being questioned by police, feel the pull of silence as something to be filled, to be answered, to be relieved. Howell sat with it easily, without visible discomfort. He noted that Howell never asked questions, never said, even once, "Do you know what happened to those boys? Do you have any idea who might have done this?" Which is the kind of question that innocent people who are genuinely horrified by a tragedy in their community, tend to ask. And he noted that when the conversation touched on certain specifics, the road where the witnesses had seen the truck, the timing of the evening, Howell's eyes went to a slightly different place. Not a dramatic shift, nothing that would look anything in a film. Just a small, subtle redirection of attention that Calvert filed carefully away. When the interview was over, Howell stood up, shook hands with both detectives, and left. He drove away in his dark blue truck. Calvert sat at his desk and looked at his notes for a long time. He couldn't prove anything. Not yet. Not remotely. But he knew what he felt. And what he felt was that Gerald Howell was a person who needed to be looked at very carefully. The alibi that Howell had offered, the bar, the witnesses, was checked immediately. Calvert assigned another detective to go to the bar and speak to the staff, and to the people Howell had named. The bartender remembered Howell as a regular, but could not specifically confirm that he had been there on the evening of July 12th. It had been 3 months. And while he could say that Howell came in regularly, pinning it to a specific date was beyond what his memory could offer with confidence. 2 of the 3 people Howell had named confirmed that they had seen him at the bar that evening. The third, a man who'd apparently moved away from Fort Worth in the intervening months, could not be reached. 2 out of 3 witnesses confirming an alibi for 3 months earlier. That was not nothing, but it was also not a closed door. Calvert requested a search of Gerald Howell's property. The request required establishing probable cause to a standard that, at this stage of the investigation, could not quite be met. The conversation with Howell, the neighbor mentions, the truck that matched a vague description, the incomplete alibi, none of it, individually or together, reached the legal threshold required for a search warrant. And without a search warrant, Calvert could only do so much. This was the wall that many investigations hit. And it is a wall built for good reasons: the protection of civil liberties, the prevention of arbitrary state power over individuals' lives and property. But standing on one side of that wall, holding the weight of 3 missing boys and the grief of 3 families, Roy Calvert felt it with the particular acuteness that investigators in this situation have described in case after across the country. The law is correct, and the law is unbearable. Both things can be true simultaneously. He kept Howell in his peripheral vision. He kept gathering, kept asking, kept looking at the edges of the picture, and the investigation moved on. In November of 1974, 4 months after the disappearance, the case developed in a direction that no one had anticipated. A man came into the Fort Worth Police Department and asked to speak to someone about the missing boys. He was in his mid-40s, well dressed in a slightly disheveled way that suggested someone who had made an effort and was not entirely comfortable with the result. He sat down across from a detective, not Calvert, who was in a meeting, and told a story that shifted the investigation significantly. His name was Arthur Lemond. He was an insurance salesman who worked out of an office on the north side of Fort Worth. He said he had come in because he had information that he had been sitting on for 4 months and couldn't sit on anymore, and that it had been making him sick with guilt, and he needed to say what he knew. He said that on the evening of July 1974, he had been driving east on the road where the witnesses had reported seeing the truck. He said he had passed a truck that was pulled to the side of the road, and that he had slowed slightly because the truck's flashers were on, not emergency flashers, but the parking light indicators that sometimes indicate a vehicle is temporarily stopped. And in slowing, he had seen briefly what was happening near the truck. He had seen boys. 3 of them, he thought, and a man. And the man had been speaking to the boys with what Lemon described as an urgency that struck him as strange, though he hadn't understood it at the time. He had kept driving. He had told himself it was nothing. A man giving directions to some teenagers, or selling them something, or asking them about something. It was nothing. But then the faces of the 3 boys had appeared on flyers, and he had recognized them, and the guilt of having driven past and not stopped, of having told himself it was nothing, had been accumulating in him for 4 months. Calvert was brought in immediately. Over the next several hours, Arthur Lemon described what he had seen with as much detail as he could muster. Understanding that 4 months had passed, and that memory is imperfect, and that he was trying to reconstruct something he had witnessed, for only a handful of seconds from inside a moving vehicle. He described the man near the truck, medium to large build, tall. He thought the man was wearing work clothes of some kind, not a uniform. Just the kind of clothes a person wears when they do physical work. He couldn't describe the face clearly. The light had not been good, but he remembered, and this was the detail that Calvert, when he heard it, felt like a cold hand closing around something inside his chest. He remembered that as he drove past, the man near the truck had looked up and watched his car go. Had watched it until it passed. Not with the casual look of someone glancing at a passing vehicle, but with a focused, assessing attention that Lemond had noticed without understanding. The look of a person cataloging whether they had been seen. The look of a person deciding whether a witness had just driven past. Calvert looked at his notes. He looked at the description. He thought about the man sitting across from him in an interview room 6 weeks earlier, the man who sat comfortably with silence, who never asked what happened to those boys. He thought about the dark blue truck. He thought about the alibi that was 2/3 confirmed. He asked Arthur Lemond if he would be willing to look at some photographs. Lemond said yes. Photo arrays in 1974 were conducted differently from how they are conducted today. The science of eyewitness identification, the research into how memory works under stress, the protocols developed in subsequent decades to reduce the possibility of suggestion, none of that existed in the form it now takes. In 1974, an investigator might sit with a witness, lay out photographs, and watch. And what Calvert observed as Arthur Lemond went through the photographs was something he would describe in his case notes as a response that I do not believe was manufactured. When Lemond reached the photograph of Gerald Howell, he stopped. He looked at it for a long time, longer than he had to any of the others. His hand, which had been moving fairly steadily through the array, became still. He said he wasn't sure. He said he couldn't say for certain, because the light had been bad and he had only seen the man briefly, and it had been 4 months. But he said the man in the photograph looked like the man he had seen near the truck on the road on the evening of July 20th. He thought it was him. He couldn't be certain, but he thought it was him. Roy Calvert thanked Arthur Lemond, made sure he had Lemond's contact information, and watched him leave. Then he sat at his desk in the quiet of his office and thought carefully about where the investigation stood. He had an eyewitness, a partial, uncertain eyewitness, but an eyewitness, who placed a man resembling Gerald Howell near a dark, colored truck on the road where the 3 missing boys had last been seen, at approximately the time they had last been seen. He had a truck that matched the description. He had a neighborhood connection that placed Howell within the world the boys had inhabited. He had an alibi that was not fully confirmed. He had a man who, in his professional judgment, had displayed the behavioral markers of someone with something to conceal. What he did not have was the boys. He did not have a crime scene. He did not have physical evidence of any kind connecting Howell to the disappearance. He did not have a confession. He did not have enough, by any legal standard, to arrest Gerald Howell or to compel a search of his property. And he did not know, this was the thing that he came back to, in his notes, in the conversations his colleagues remembered having with him about this case. He did not know what had happened to Thomas Simmons, Charles Buckingham, and Michael Shirley. He could not yet say whether they were alive. He could not yet say where they were. He could not say, with any legal authority, that a crime had been committed at all. This was where the investigation stood in November of 1974. Pointed in a direction, pointed with a conviction that, in Calvert's own professional assessment, was not unfounded, but pointed without the evidence to move. December arrived. Christmas came to the Fort Worth neighborhood with the particular weight with the first holiday season after a devastating loss always carries. The 3 families navigated it as best they could. Donna Shirley put up a small tree for the sake of her younger children. Patricia Simmons went through the motions of the season, the way you go through the motions of things, when you are holding yourself together with sheer force of will. Charles Buckingham's parents sat in their house with Danny, 11 years old and quiet in a way he hadn't been before, and tried to give him a Christmas that felt like something. That felt like more than the absence at the center of everything. The boys' names were not forgotten. The community had not moved on. In neighborhoods like that one, in communities built on proximity and familiarity, that is not how it works. The absence of Thomas and Charles and Michael was a continuous presence. It sat in the church pews on Sunday. It sat in the bleachers at school sports events. It sat at the tables of neighborhood families who had known the boys their whole lives, a presence made of absence. But the year turned. 1974 became 1975. In January of 1975, Roy Calvert received a phone call from a woman who had seen the contact information posted at the police department in relation to the missing boys, and who said she had something she needed to tell someone. Even if she wasn't sure whether it was important, her name was Beverly Estes, and she lived in a neighborhood about 4 miles from where the 3 boys had lived. She worked as a cashier at a grocery store. She said she had a neighbor she was reluctant to name him at first, hesitant in a way that Calvert recognized as the hesitance of someone who understands the weight of what they are about to say, and she said that this neighbor had been behaving strangely since the previous summer. She said he had always been odd. She chose that word carefully, said it with a slight pause before and after, wanting Calvert to understand that odd didn't mean criminal, that she wasn't accusing anyone of anything, just that there had always been something about him that made the hair on her arms stand up slightly. And since the summer, since around the time of the disappearance of those 3 boys from across town, his behavior had shifted in ways she couldn't precisely articulate. He was more withdrawn. He drove away at unusual hours. He had backed his truck into the garage one evening, shortly after the disappearance, and hadn't moved it for 2 weeks, and when he finally did drive it again, it was clean in a way it hadn't been before. Freshly cleaned, she thought, Though she understood that might mean nothing, Calvert asked her the neighbor's name. She told him. It was Gerald Howell. Beverly Estes Street was approximately 2 miles from the house Howell had lived in when he was in the neighborhood where the boys had lived. He had moved there, to a rented house on Beverly Estes Street, in early 1974, when he vacated his previous residence. He had been her neighbor for about 6 months before the disappearance. Calvert drove to Beverly Estes Street the same afternoon he spoke to her on the phone. He parked at the end of the block and observed Howell's house for a while. It was a small house, like most of the houses on that street, single-story brick, a modest yard. A detached garage at the side that was clearly used for the truck, because the truck was parked in front of it. Too large for the space, sitting in the January light in a way that gave nothing away. He noted the layout of the property. He noted the garage. He noted that the house had minimal visibility from the street, a large tree in the front yard, overgrown hedges along one side. He noted that there was a patch of ground behind the garage that was, from what he could see, not easily visible from any neighboring property. He drove away. He went back to his desk. He picked up the phone and called the Tarrant County District Attorney's office. He had a conversation about probable cause, about search warrants, about what he had and what he didn't have and where the threshold was. It was a conversation that lasted over an hour. When it was done, both men agreed that they were close. Closer than they had been, but not yet over the line. Find me one more thing, the prosecutor told him. One more solid thing and we move. Roy Calvert put down the phone. He looked at the wall of his office, where he had pinned photographs of Thomas Simmons and Charles Buckingham and Michael Shirley, school photographs. The kind where the lighting is flat and the background is a shade of blue that no background in real life ever quite is, and the subjects are sitting slightly awkwardly because no one is comfortable having their picture taken. 3 boys, looking at the camera with the slightly uncertain expressions of people who are not sure what their face is supposed to be doing. He was going to find that one more thing. He was going to find it even if it took him the rest of his career. And what he didn't know, on that January afternoon in 1975, was that it was not going to come from where he expected. It was not going to come from a witness or a document or a piece of physical evidence turned up by patient canvassing. It was going to come from a place that was unexpected, and it was going to shake the investigation loose in a way that nobody, not Calvert, not the families, not anyone, could have predicted. It was going to come from Gerald Howell himself. February in Fort Worth is a gray, uncertain month. The winter never fully commits in that part of Texas. It doesn't deliver the dramatic, immobilizing snowstorms of the northern states, but it withholds the warmth too, leaving behind a damp, low-sky coldness that sits on the city like a lid. The trees are bare, the light is thin. People move through their days with their collars turned up and their heads down, waiting for a season that hasn't decided yet which direction it's going. Roy Calvert spent February 1975 doing what he had been doing since October, gathering, watching, circling. He had expanded his understanding of Gerald Howell considerably in the weeks since Beverly Estes' call. Not through any single dramatic revelation, but through the slow accumulation of small facts that, taken together, built a portrait of a man who existed in the world in a particular way. A way that Calvert had seen before in other cases in other men, and that he recognized with the cold clarity of professional experience. Howell had no serious criminal record. A DUI from 1968 that had been processed through the courts in the ordinary way and resulted in a fine and a suspended license. An arrest in 1971 for disorderly conduct at a bar. A fight that witnesses described as disproportionate, that left the other man needing stitches, which had been reduced to a misdemeanor and resolved with a small fine. Nothing that announced itself. Nothing that would make him stand out in a background check. Not in the way that would make investigators immediately flag him as a dangerous individual. But there were other things. Things that didn't show up in formal records but emerged from conversations. Calvert had spoken to people who knew Howell from the construction sites where he worked. He had spoken to people from the neighborhood where Howell had lived before Beverly Estes Street. And a picture had emerged that was consistent, that had a texture to it, a recognizable shape. Howell had a particular interest in teenage boys. Not something that had ever been formally reported. Not something that anyone had named directly in those exact words, because in 1975 the language for naming such things was different, and the threshold for speaking about them was higher, and the cultural willingness to take such observations seriously was far less developed than it would become. But when Calvert spoke to people and asked the right questions, the answers he got moved in the same direction. Howell had a way of inserting himself into the peripheral lives of teenage boys in the neighborhoods where he lived. He offered rides. He offered small amounts of money for odd jobs. He was present at the edges of their world in a way that, taken alone, might seem merely sociable, but taken together with everything else, took on a different character entirely. Calvert documented all of it, carefully, meticulously, building a file that grew thicker through February and into March. And then, on a Tuesday morning in the middle of March 1975, Gerald Howell made a mistake. It was not a dramatic mistake. It was not the kind of mistake that happens in films, where a guilty man does something obviously incriminating that causes the whole case to crack open at once. It was smaller than that, more ordinary. The kind of mistake that arises not from stupidity, because Howell, whatever else he was not stupid, but from the particular pressure that builds inside a person who is carrying thing enormous and secret and heavy, and who eventually, under that pressure, does something slightly wrong. He went back to the road. Beverly Estes called Calvert on a Tuesday morning, and Howell had driven out the previous evening in his truck, which was not unusual, except that he had returned several hours later on foot, without the truck, and had seemed agitated in a way that she could see from her window. The way he came through the front door quickly, with his head down looking behind him. And then, the following morning, he had walked several blocks away, and she had watched from her car as he retrieved the truck from where it was parked on a street she named. Calvert looked up the street she named on a map of Fort Worth. It was within a quarter-mile of the road where the witnesses had placed the dark truck on the evening of July 12, 1974. He sat with that for a moment. He sat with the question of why a man would drive to that particular stretch of road 8 months after 3 boys had disappeared from it, park his truck, walk home, and retrieve it the following morning. He sat with what that behavior might mean, what it might indicate about the man's relationship to that place, what it might suggest about why that place held any significance for Gerald Howell at all. And then he picked up the phone and called the district attorney's office again. The conversation this time was different from the previous ones. It was longer. It covered more ground. By the end of it, both men agreed that the cumulative weight of what Calvert had assembled, the eyewitness account from Arthur Lemond, however partial, the behavioral observations from Beverly Estes, the pattern of Howell's interest in teenage boys from multiple neighborhoods, the truck that matched the description, the alibi that remained 2/3 confirmed, and now this unexplained return to the geography of the disappearance 8 months later, had moved the case past the threshold that the prosecutor was willing to take to a judge. The search warrant application was filed on March 17, 1975. It was granted the following day. The search of Gerald Howell's property on Beverly Estes Street took place on the morning of March 19, 1975. It is worth pausing here for a moment before describing what investigators found, to acknowledge the weight of that morning. Roy Calvert had been working this case for 8 months. The families of 3 boys had been living inside an incomprehensible uncertainty for the same 8 months. And the search warrant that had just been granted represented the first moment in the entire investigation, where the legal machinery had moved in a way that could potentially produce answers. Calvert was present for the search. He stood in the morning light outside Howell's house as the search team went in, and he felt by his own later account, not the anticipation of vindication, not the eagerness of a detective about to crack a case open, but something quieter and considerably heavier. Because the thing about searching a property in a case like this is that you are hoping to find something, and you are terrified of finding it. Every detective who has worked missing persons cases of this nature understands that duality. Finding something means answers. Finding something also means the worst thing has been confirmed. Howell was not at the house when the search began. He had left early that morning, before the search team arrived, which was noted, and which meant that a separate team had been dispatched to locate him and bring him in for questioning. The search team worked through the house first. It was sparsely furnished in the way of a person who lives alone, and has no particular investment in their domestic surroundings. There were no obvious signs of anything significant in the main living areas. The kitchen, the bedroom, the small bathroom, all examined thoroughly, all producing evidence of nothing more than the ordinary disorder of a single man's life. The garage was different. The garage was where Gerald Howell kept his truck, and it was the garage that Beverly Estes had observed him drive into the night of the disappearance. The garage from which the truck had emerged 2 weeks later, clean in a way it hadn't been before. The garage had a concrete floor that had been, at some point in the not-too-distant past, very thoroughly cleaned. The investigators documented this. They documented the chemical smell that lingered beneath the surface smell of oil and dust. They documented the areas near the drain in the floor, where the concrete had a slightly different color from the surrounding area, not visibly different at first glance, but different enough under the lights the search team brought in. Luminol testing, a tool that investigators had been using for several deaths by 1975, which causes blood, even blood that has been cleaned, even blood that is not visible to the naked eye, to glow blue under ultraviolet light. In the garage of Gerald Howell's rented house on a street in Fort Worth, Texas, the luminol produced results that were, by the documentation of the search team present that morning, extensive. The floor of the garage lit up. I want to be careful here about what the luminol results did and did not mean, because in this case, as in so many cases, the evidence needs to be understood precisely. Luminol indicates the presence of blood. It does not identify whose blood. It does not establish the circumstances under which the blood was shed, and blood in a garage in isolation is not automatically evidence of a violent crime. Garages are places where people work on vehicles, where cuts happen, where blood ends up for entirely innocent reasons. But the extent of what the luminol revealed in Howell's garage was not consistent with an ordinary cut or minor injury. The coverage was significant. It covered an area of the floor that suggested a substantial quantity of blood had been present at some point, and had been subsequently cleaned with considerable thoroughness. The search team documented everything. They collected samples from the floor for laboratory analysis. They collected soil samples from the area behind the garage, which was softer than the surrounding ground, and showed signs of relatively recent disturbance, though winter weather had muddied the timeline of that disturbance considerably. They collected items from inside the truck, fibers, trace materials, which were packaged and sent for analysis. They also found in a wooden box on a shelf in the garage a collection of items that were, in the context of this investigation, deeply significant. They were small things, the kinds of things a person might carry in their pockets. A pocket knife with a worn handle, a few coins, a small carved wooden object. Items that appeared to have been collected and kept, arranged in the box with a deliberateness that was distinct from the general disorder of the rest of the garage. One of the items in the box was a ring. A simple metal ring, the kind a teenager might wear. It was photographed, documented, placed into evidence. When the photograph of the ring was shown to Donna Shirley several days later, she looked at it for a long moment. And then she said, quietly, that she believed it was Michael's. That Michael had worn a ring like that. That she had given it to him for his birthday. She could not be 100% certain. It was a simple ring, not custom-made, not unique in any verifiable way. But she believed it was her son's. Gerald Howell was located that morning at a diner several miles from his house, sitting in a booth with a cup of coffee. 2 detectives approached him. They told him they needed him to come with them. He looked at them for a moment with the same opaque expression that Calvert had observed in the interview room months earlier. And then he put down his coffee cup and stood up and went with them without a word. He was brought to the Fort Worth Police Department and placed in an interview room. Roy Calvert came in 40 minutes later, after the initial processing was complete. He sat down across from Gerald Howell and looked at him. Howell looked back. There was a silence that lasted longer than silences usually last in interview rooms, and then Calvert began. He did not tell Howell immediately what had been found in the garage. He did not lead with the luminol results or the box or the ring. He had conducted enough interviews to know that the beginning of a conversation like this is rarely where the significant things happen. The significant things happen later, when the pressure has been building long enough to find the cracks in a person's composure. He started instead with the easy questions. The biographical questions. Where are you from? How long have you been in Fort Worth? What kind of work do you do? Howell answered, calmly, without the visible agitation that some people show when they find themselves in an interview room, without the excessive eagerness to cooperate that other people show, the eagerness that has its own kind of transparency. He was simply there answering questions, his large hands flat on the table, his face arranged in an expression that gave away nothing. Calvert moved the conversation gradually, toward the neighborhood, toward the boys, toward the truck and the road in the evening of 1974. He moved slowly and watched the way Howell moved with him, the slight adjustments in his posture, the moments where his eyes shifted from Calvert's face to the middle distance and then back. When Calvert told him about the luminol results in the garage, Howell said nothing for a long moment. And then he said that he did a lot of work on his truck, that he cut himself all the time. That blood in a garage was not unusual. His voice as he said it had not changed in any audible way. But his hands, which had been flat on the table, had curled slightly at the edges. Calvert noted it. He showed Howell a photograph of the ring. He asked if Howell recognized it. Howell said he didn't know where it had come from. He said he found things sometimes, picked things up. He had a habit of collecting odds and ends. He couldn't account for everything in that box. Calvert asked him why he had driven to the road near the intersection. The road where the witnesses had placed the truck the night the boys disappeared, 8 months after they went missing, and left his truck there overnight. Howell said he'd had a few drinks that evening and hadn't wanted to drive. It was a reasonable answer. It was the kind of answer that covered the observable facts without admitting anything. Calvert had been in this room with enough people to know the difference between the truth and a prepared answer that sits on top of the truth. And what he was hearing from Gerald Howell was the latter. But reasonable answers, even when you know they're not honest, are not confessions. And confessions were what the case needed. The interview lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, Howell had said nothing that could be used against him in court. Nothing that crossed the line from plausible denial into admission. He had accounted for himself, inadequately but not impossibly, for every specific point that Calvert raised. He had sat through 4 hours of steady, patient, professionally applied pressure without breaking. He was not charged that day. He was not arrested. There was not yet enough, not with the evidence in hand, not with the laboratory results still pending, not with the identification of the ring based on one grieving mother's belief, rather than a verifiable certainty, to hold him. He walked out of the Fort Worth Police Department on the afternoon of March 19, 1975, got into his dark blue truck, and drove away. Calvert watched him go from a window in his office. He had the feeling, a professional feeling, calibrated by years of experience, not a melodramatic one, that Gerald Howell knew exactly how close the walls had come, and that he was going to start making decisions based on that knowledge. He was right. Within 48 hours of the interview, Gerald Howell moved out of a house on Beverly Estes Street. He packed what he could into his truck and left the rented house with 2 weeks of unpaid rent on the lease, which was the kind of detail that a landlord would later note with frustration, and that Calvert would note with a different kind of attention entirely. People who have nothing to hide do not typically empty their houses in 2 days and drive away from their lives without notice. Calvert alerted law enforcement agencies across the region. He filed the appropriate paperwork. He put out the word through the networks available to him in 1975, which were considerably more limited than what exists today. No national databases. No automated alert systems, no way to electronically flag a vehicle or a person across state lines in anything close to real time. He did what he could with what he had, and he waited for the laboratory results. The results came back in April 1975. They were in several respects significant, and in several others they were agonizingly insufficient. The blood evidence from the garage floor was confirmed as human blood. The quantity and distribution were consistent with a serious injury, or injuries to one or more individuals, but the technology available in 1975 for blood typing was limited to ABO blood group analysis, the broad categorization of blood into types A, B, AB, or O. DNA analysis as an investigative tool did not yet exist. The blood recovered from Howell's garage floor was typed as type O, which is the most common blood type in the human population. Thomas Simmons was type O, so was Charles Buckingham. So as it turned out, were approximately 45% of all human beings on Earth. The result confirmed the presence of human blood. It was consistent with the blood types of 2 of the 3 missing boys. It was also consistent with the blood of hundreds of thousands of other people in Fort Worth alone. The trace evidence from the truck fiber's hair was analyzed. Some of it was consistent with the types of clothing described as worn by the boys on the evening of their disappearance. None of it could be definitively identified as having come from any of the 3 boys. The ring could not be conclusively linked to Michael Shirley. The soil disturbance behind the garage had been compromised by winter weather to the point where investigators could not establish a timeline or the nature of what had disturbed it. In sum, the evidence pointed. It pointed clearly in the direction of Gerald Howell's guilt, in the direction of something terrible having taken place in that garage. But pointing is not proving. And proving was what the law required. The Tarrant County District Attorney reviewed everything that Calvert had assembled and delivered a verdict that was, by any measure, the correct legal verdict and simultaneously one of the most difficult moments in the history of this investigation. There was not enough evidence to charge Gerald Howell with anything related to the disappearance of Thomas Simmons, Charles Buckingham, and Michael Shirley. Not yet. Perhaps not ever, if Howell remained beyond reach and the physical evidence remained what it was. The families were told. Patricia Simmons Shirley, the Buckingham family. They were told that the investigation was ongoing, that a significant person of interest had been identified, that law enforcement was continuing to pursue the case with all available resources. They were told in the careful, measured language that law enforcement uses when it needs to be both honest and humane simultaneously. Language that conveys seriousness without conveying the specific anguish of what the investigators themselves are feeling. Patricia Simmons, in an interview she gave to a Fort Worth newspaper several years later, described receiving that information in 1975. She said that the detective, she referred to Calvert with a respect and a complicated affection that was evident in the way she spoke his name, had sat with her at her kitchen table, and had told her what they had found and what it meant and what it didn't yet mean. And she had listened, and she had understood, and she had thanked him for coming to tell her in person. And then she had waited until he left, and she had gone to Thomas's room, which she had kept exactly as it was since the July morning. She had understood he was not coming home, and she had sat on his bed for a very long time. She did not describe what she thought about. Sitting there, some things don't have words. Some things exist at a level below language, in the body and the chest and the place where a mother's love for her child lives. And language is simply not equipped to reach them. She said she sat there until it got dark. And then she got up and went to the kitchen and made dinner, because her other children needed to eat. Gerald Howell had, in the weeks since vacating the house on Beverly Estes Street, made his way approximately 90 miles west of Fort Worth to a small city in West Texas where he had a distant relation, a cousin he had not been in close contact with for years. He took up temporary residence, found intermittent work at a construction site on the edge of the city, and kept a low profile in the way that a person keeps a low profile when they understand that their profile needs to be kept low. He was not in hiding, exactly. He had made no particular effort to conceal his location from the people who knew him. He had simply moved on, the way people sometimes move on, in a direction that took him further from Fort Worth and from the investigation that was closing around him. But Calvert had not lost track of him. Calvert never lost track of him. Through contacts in the West Texas law enforcement community, through the periodic checks that he continued to run, through a network of professional relationships that he had built over his career, Calvert maintained awareness of where Gerald Howell was and what he was doing. He was not in a position to compel Howell's return. He was not in a position to arrest him, but he knew where he was, and he continued building the case. The summer of 1975 arrived, and with it the first anniversary of the disappearance of Thomas Simmons, Charles Buckingham, and Michael Shirley. The community of their neighborhood in Fort Worth marked it in the way that communities mark such things. With a gathering at the church most of the families attended, with a moment of public remembrance, with the collective acknowledgement that a year had passed, and the boys were still gone, and the wound was still open, and the world had nonetheless continued. The Fort Worth Star-Telegram ran a piece about the case in July of 1975, a long article that laid out what was publicly out about the investigation and what was not. The article was careful. It did not name Gerald Howell, because naming a person of interest who had not been charged with any crime is legally and ethically fraught, but it made clear that investigators believed they had identified a direction and were pursuing it. It also made clear, through the testimony of the families and through the careful observations of the journalist who wrote it, that the pace of that pursuit felt to the people most affected by it like something that moved too slowly through a landscape, where every day of slowness was another day of loss. The article generated response. Tips came in. Some of them were useless. Some of them were the well-meaning but uninformed contributions of people who wanted to help and had nothing concrete to offer. And some of them, a small number, were things that Calvert filed away and returned to, because they touched on aspects of the case that continued to develop. One of the tips came from a woman in a small town in West Texas. She said she had a neighbor. She described his truck. She described the way he was quiet, the way he kept to himself, the way he had arrived in the middle of March and never fully explained where he was from or why he had come. She said he made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't fully articulate. She gave his name. Calvert already knew it, but the call confirmed the address, and it confirmed something else, that Gerald Howell, 90 miles away in a West Texas city, was not as invisible as he might have hoped. In September 1975, 14 months after the disappearance, a development occurred that moved the case in a direction that nobody had anticipated. It came not from Fort Worth, not from the ongoing investigation, not from any action that Roy Calvert or his team had taken. It came from Gerald Howell himself, obliquely and without his intention or knowledge, through the medium of another crime entirely. A teenager in the West Texas city, where Howell had been living since March, came forward and reported to local police that a man had approached him on 2 separate occasions over the previous weeks, offering him money to help with some work, and that on the second occasion, when the boy had declined, the man had followed him for several blocks, colored truck, before eventually driving away. The boy had been shaken enough by the experience to tell his parents, and his parents had taken him to the police. A description of the man, the description of the truck, the street where the encounters had taken place, which was within 2 blocks of the address where Gerald Howell was renting a room. Local police in the West Texas city, following up on the report, contacted the boy and his family. They identified the man from the description and the location, and they ran his name through the available records. The flag that Calvert had placed on Howell's name came back immediately. The West Texas detective who made the call to Roy Calvert later described the conversation as one of the more memorable of his career. Not because of anything dramatic that was said, but because of the quality of the silence on the other end of the line. In the moment after he told Calvert what had happened, before Calvert said anything in response, it was the silence of a man who had been patient for 14 months, and had just been handed, not the proof he needed, but the thread he could follow. The thread that might, if handled carefully, If followed with the same patience and stubbornness that had defined his entire approach to this case, lead somewhere, Calvert said. Don't lose him. And then he arranged to go to West Texas. What was building now in the fall of 1975, 14 months after three boys walked east on a summer evening and did not come home, was a pressure that had been accumulating in the case since its beginning. The evidence in Fort Worth, the behavioral pattern across multiple neighborhoods, the eyewitness account, partial and uncertain but there, the blood in the garage, the rent, and now this a new instance of the same behavior in a new city, aimed at a new boy who had, unlike Thomas and Charles and Michael, been wary enough and lucky enough to go home and tell someone. Roy Calvert drove to West Texas on a Wednesday morning in September 1975. He drove through the landscape that unfolds west of Fort Worth, the city giving way to suburbs, the suburbs giving way to the flat, wide-open scrubland of West Texas, the sky getting bigger as you go, the horizon getting further away, the sense of human density thinning, until you are moving through a landscape that feels both ancient and indifferent. He arrived in the city where Gerald Howell was living in the early afternoon. He met with the local detective. He reviewed the report. He spoke briefly with the boy and his parents. Careful, measured, conscious of the boy's age and the fragility of the situation. And then he and the local detective drove to the street where Gerald Howell was renting a room and knocked on the door. Howell answered. He saw Calvert, and something moved across his face in that moment, something that was there for only a fraction of a second before his expression settled back into its habitual opacity. But that Calvert saw clearly, and that he would describe in his notes as the look of a man who had known, somewhere beneath his own awareness, that this moment was coming. Calvert said, "I think it's time we talked again, Gerald." And Gerald Howell, after a moment that seemed to stretch in the West Texas afternoon light, stepped back from the door. The room that Gerald Howell was renting in West Texas was small and spare in the way that rented rooms in small cities often are. A single bed against one wall. A wooden dresser with a warped drawer that didn't quite close. A window that looked out onto the street, the curtain half drawn against the afternoon light. A table with two chairs. The kind of table that exists in rooms like this purely because a room needs something to put things on. There was a coffee mug on it, still holding an inch of cold coffee. A newspaper, folded to the crossword page half completed. Small details of a small, deliberately reduced life. Calvert sat in one of the chairs. The local detective stood near the door. Howell sat on the edge of the bed, his large hands between his knees, and looked at the floor. The room was quiet. Outside, somewhere down the street, a dog was barking at something with the persistent, unfocused energy of a dog that barks for the sake of barking. The sound came in through the half-open window and then faded. The room settled back into its silence. Calvert did not open with the report from the local police. He did not open with the boy in the truck and the two encounters on the street. He had thought carefully, on the drive out from Fort Worth, about how to approach this second extended conversation with Gerald Howell, and he had decided to begin where they had left off in March, not in a confrontational way, but in the way of a man continuing a conversation that had simply been interrupted. As if the intervening 6 months, the flight from Fort Worth, the rented room in West Texas, the whole geography of distance between then and now were merely a pause. He asked Howell how the construction work was going. He asked about the new city, whether he had settled in, whether he found it different from Fort Worth. Howell answered in the minimal way he always answered. A few words. Enough to be a response, not enough to be anything more. His eyes, as he spoke, stayed on the floor. Calvert watched him. He was looking for something he had been looking for since the first interview. The specific place where the composure was thinnest. The specific subject or pressure that produced the most visible strain. In the first interview, it had been the moment when Calvert mentioned the road near the intersection. He had seen it then, that fractional flicker, the slight curl of the hands. He had filed it away and he had been building toward it ever since. He let the silence run for a while. The dog outside had stopped barking. The curtain moved slightly in a warm West Texas breeze. And then Calvert said, "Gerald." I want to tell you what I've been thinking about for the past 14 months. What followed was not an interrogation in the conventional sense. It was something more difficult and more deliberate than that. Calvert did not use the aggressive tactics that some investigators employ. The raised voice, the accusatory stance, the theatrical presentation of evidence designed to shock a confession free from its hiding place. He had considered that approach and set it aside, not because he had any particular reluctance to pressure Gerald Howell, but because he understood Howell well enough by now to know it would not work. Howell's particular kind of composure, the opaque, silent, self-contained quality that had defined him across every interaction, was not the composure of a man who breaks under aggression. Aggression would simply cause him to withdraw further, to become more sealed, to wrap himself in silence the way a person wraps themselves in a coat against the cold. What Howell might respond to, Calvert believed, was something different. He might respond to the sense that the walls were fully and finally closed, that the accounting was inevitable, and that the only remaining question was the form it would take. He might respond to the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying something enormous for 14 months alone, in a series of rented rooms in cities where no one knew you. Calvert talked. He laid it out piece by piece, the witnesses in the truck and the road, the luminol in the garage, the blood evidence and what the laboratory had found, the ring that Donna Shirley believed was her son's, the behavioral pattern that Calvert had documented across 2 neighborhoods and now a 3rd city, the boy who had come to the local police 2 weeks ago and described a man in a dark truck. He laid it all out without theatrics, without urgency, in the same measured tone that he might have used to describe the contents of a case file to a colleague. Just the facts assembled in sequence, the shape they made when you put them together. He talked for a long time. Howell sat on the edge of the bed and listened and said nothing. When Calvert finished, the room was very quiet again. The afternoon light through the half-drawn curtain had moved slightly, the way it does in the late afternoon, shifting from bright white to a warmer, slightly amber quality. The coffee in the mug on the table had been cold for hours. Howell lifted his head and looked at Calvert for the first time since the conversation had begun. His expression was the same as it always was, that opacity, that surface that gave nothing away. But his eyes were different. Something in them had changed. Something that Calvert, who had been watching the eyes carefully for 6 months, recognized as the very first visible crack in a wall that had been, until that moment, completely seamless. Howell said, "What do you want from me?" And Calvert said, very quietly, "I want to know where they are." He did not confess that day. That needs to be said clearly, because the truth of this case is not a neat or complete truth, and presenting it as one would be a disservice to the families and to the history of the investigation. Gerald Howell did not sit in that small rented room in West Texas on a September afternoon in 1975 and confess to what he had done. He was not, in the end, that kind of man. He did not have the capacity, or perhaps more accurately, he did not have whatever it is in a person that allows them to move from concealment to acknowledgement, from the long and terrible privacy of guilt to the terrifying exposure of admission. What he said in the silence that followed Calvert's question was this: "I don't know what you're talking about." The same words, the same flat denial. But the voice that delivered them was different from the voice that had delivered her denials 6 months earlier in a Fort Worth interview room. It was quieter. It had a quality that Calvert, in his notes, described as drained. As if the words had been said because they needed to be said, because the habit of saying them was too deep to break, but not because they were accompanied by any real conviction. The interview continued for another 2 hours. It covered the same ground it had covered before and some new ground. Howell's answers remained denials, remained the carefully constructed alternate explanations and the expressions of ignorance. But the quality of them was different. They had a different weight. They sat in the room differently. At the end of the interview, Calvert told Howell that the West Texas Police Department had received a formal complaint about his behavior toward the teenage boy, and that this complaint was being taken seriously, and that his situation in this city was not going to be comfortable going forward. He told Howell that the investigation in Fort Worth was not closed and was not going to close. He told him that the accounting he was describing, the inevitable accounting, was going to come, and that the only variable was the timing and the form. He stood up. He shook Howell's hand, a deliberate choice, a professional one, because the relationship between Calvert and Howell was not one of simple antagonism. It was something more complicated, the relationship between a hunter and the hunted, which has its own strange intimacy. And he walked out of the room. In the weeks that followed, 3 things happened that trajectory of the case. The first was that Gerald Howell, responding to the pressure of the formal complaint in West Texas and the renewed attention from Fort Worth, moved again. This time he went further, across the state line into New Mexico, to a city large enough that a single man could lose himself without difficulty, but not so large that he couldn't find construction work. He rented a room. He kept his head down. He drove his truck on the roads of a new state and tried to put more distance between himself and what he carried. Calvert tracked him. It took longer this time, but Calvert had more resources than he'd had in March, had built more relationships with law enforcement agencies across the region, had established a pattern of monitoring that was, given the tools available in 1975, as thorough as it could be. The second thing that happened was that the Tarrant County District Attorney's Office, reviewing the case again in light of the West Texas incident, made a decision. The incident with the teenage boy in West Texas was, by itself, insufficient for a serious criminal charge. No assault had occurred, no crime had been proven, and the boy's account, while credible and concerning, described behavior that existed in a legal gray area. But the pattern it established, in combination with everything that had been assembled in the Fort Worth investigation, gave the DA's office something it could work with in a different direction. They began exploring whether a warrant could be issued for Howell's arrest in connection with the West Texas incident on lesser charges, charges that would allow them to bring him back into custody, to hold him, and to continue building the larger case while he was in a controlled environment where he could not simply drive away. It was an indirect approach. It was the kind of approach that investigations use when the direct path is blocked, when you cannot yet charge a person with the belief they've done, so you find the adjacent thing, the adjacent legal mechanism that gets you to the same place by a different route. This approach was being carefully developed through the fall of 1975. The third thing that happened was the most significant, and it came from the most unexpected direction. Charles Buckingham's younger brother Danny was 12 years old in the fall of 1975. He had been 11 when Charles disappeared, and the 14 months since then had changed him in the ways that exposure to catastrophic loss changes a child, had made him quieter, more watchful, older in his eyes than in his years. He had not spoken much about Charles, partly because there was nothing useful to say, and partly because the adults around him were already carrying so much that he had, with the particular sensitivity of children in crisis households, made the unconscious decision not to add to their weight. But something had been sitting with Danny Buckingham since the previous summer. Something he had not told anyone. Not because he had been instructed to keep it secret, not because anyone had threatened him or asked him to be silent, but because he was a child, and because the thing he knew existed at the intersection of two forces that often keep children from speaking: the fear that what you know won't be believed, and the fear that if it is believed, everything will become worse. In October of 1975, Danny Buckingham School held a presentation as part of a community response to the still unresolved disappearance of 3 local boys. A police officer came to the school and spoke to the students about what to do if they ever felt unsafe, about the importance of telling trusted adults about people or situations that made them uncomfortable, about the fact that there was no piece of information too small or too uncertain to share. The police officer had a kind face and spoke in a way that was direct without being frightening, and at the end of the presentation, Danny Buckingham raised his hand. He said he had something he wanted to tell someone. What Danny told the officer, and what he subsequently told Roy Calvert in a carefully managed interview conducted with Danny's parents present and a child interview specialist in the room. was this in the spring of 1974. Several months before Charles and Thomas and Michael disappeared, a man had come around the neighborhood a few times. Danny had seen him talking to Charles and Thomas on at least 2 separate occasions. He was a big man, Danny said. He had a truck. Danny described the color as dark, though he wasn't certain of the specific shade. The man had spoken to Charles and Thomas in a friendly way, from what Danny had observed from a distance. He had seemed to know them, or to be getting to know them. Danny had not seen Michael Shirley in these interactions specifically, though he acknowledged that Michael was around the neighborhood regularly, and he couldn't be certain who else had been present on those occasions. The thing that had been sitting with Danny for 14 months, the thing he had not told anyone, was this: on one of those occasions in the spring of 1974. Danny had been close enough to overhear part of the conversation, and the man with the truck had been talking to Charles about a job. A simple outdoor job, he'd said. Just needed some help clearing some land on a property he had out east of the city. He'd pay them both. He'd have another friend of theirs along too. It would be easy work and they could make some money for the summer. Charles had been interested, Danny remembered. Charles was always interested in earning money. Thomas had been more cautious, had asked more questions the way Thomas did. Danny didn't know what had come of it. He hadn't seen his brother again after that conversation. He'd been inside, he'd gotten distracted. The way 11-year-old children get distracted. He'd gone back to whatever he'd been doing. He had thought about that conversation every day for 14 months. He had been afraid to say it out loud because saying it out loud would make the shape of things clearer. And the shape of things, in the terrible logic of a child's grief, was something he was not sure he could bear. Calvert sat with Danny Buckingham's account for a long time after the interview. He sat with it the way he sat with all the significant pieces of this case, turning it over, examining it from different angles, testing it against everything else he had assembled. The account of the spring conversations, the offer of work, the property east of the city. The property east of the city. He went back through the records. He went back through everything he had compiled on Gerald Howell. The employment records, the addresses, the connections, the thin threads of documentation that attached him to specific places and times. And he found something he had noted before but until now, placed in the right context. In 1973, Gerald Howell had done some seasonal work for a property owner in a rural area east of Fort Worth. Not a formal employment arrangement, casual labor, the kind that doesn't a significant paper trail. But Calvert had documented it months earlier, because he documented everything, because everything was potentially significant until it wasn't. A property owner, a rural area, east of Fort Worth. He found the property owner's name. He found the approximate location of the property. He drove out there on a gray November morning, through the eastern corridors of Fort Worth and out into the rural landscape beyond, where the city gradually released its grip and the land opened up into the flat, brushy terrain that stretched toward the horizon in every direction. He found the property, a modest piece of land with a small farmhouse, an outbuilding, several acres of scrubland. He spoke to the property owner, who had not been in close contact with Howell since the seasonal work 2 years earlier, who remembered him as a capable laborer and an unsettling presence, and who had not particularly missed him after the working relationship ended. The property owner confirmed that Howell had been on the land regularly during that period. He confirmed that Howell had been familiar with the layout, the outbuilding, the areas of the scrubland that were more remote from the house, the sections of the property that were not easily visible from the road. Calvert walked the property. It was winter. The scrubland gray and sparse, the ground hard beneath his feet. He walked the parts of it that were most remote, most sheltered from view. He noted the landscape. He noted the areas where the ground dipped slightly, where natural features created concealment. He stood in the cold November light and looked at the land, and thought about 3 boys who had gone east on a summer evening 16 months ago, and never come home. He requested that a search team be brought to the property. The search of the rural property east of Fort Worth took over 3 days in November 1975. It was a thorough search, cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating equipment where it was available, investigators working in a systematic grid pattern across the acreage. It was conducted with the seriousness and the care that the case demanded, and it was conducted under the specific weight of what it was: a search for the remains of 3 teenage boys in the land east of the city, where they had lived their whole lives. I am going to tell you what was found, and I am going to tell it to you directly, because the families of Thomas Simmons, Charles Buckingham, and Michael Shirley have lived with this reality for decades, and to soften it or obscure it or approach it obliquely would be a disservice to them and to the truth. On the second day of the search, in a section of scrubland approximately 300 yards from the outbuilding, in an area where the ground showed signs of historical disturbance that had been largely reclaimed by the landscape over the passage of 16 months, investigators found human remains. 3 sets. The remains were skeletal, given the time that had passed and the conditions of the Texas soil and climate. They were found in close proximity to one another, in a location that was sheltered from view on 3 sides by natural features of the landscape. They had been placed there. This was the assessment of the forensic investigators, based on the positioning and the proximity, rather than having arrived there by any other means. The identification process took several weeks, conducted with the forensic methods available in 1975. It was not the swift, definitive process that modern DNA technology would allow. It relied on dental records, on skeletal measurements, on the careful and painstaking work of forensic specialists who were reconstructing an identification from physical evidence that the passage of time had made incomplete. But it was enough. By December 1975, the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office had completed its analysis. The remains were those of Thomas Simmons, Charles Buckingham, and Michael Shirley. They had been found 16 months after they walked east on a summer evening and did not come home. They had been found. The notifications to the families were made in person by Roy Calvert, accompanied by a department chaplain. He went to each house individually on the same day in sequence: Simmons first, then Buckingham, then Shirley, and he sat with each family, and he told them what had been found and what had been confirmed. He did it in the way that such things are done, when they are done with humanity and care, directly, without euphemism, without false comfort, with the specific and steady presence of a person who understands that the only thing he can offer in this moment is the truth, and his willingness to sit with the people who are receiving it. Patricia Simmons later said that when Calvert came to the door, she knew. She said she had known the moment she saw his face, before he said a single word, that he was bringing the confirmation of the thing she had been holding at a careful distance for 16 months. She let him in. She sat down at her kitchen table. Her husband sat beside her. Calvert sat across from them and told them that Thomas had been found, and that he was not coming home. She said she did not cry right away. She said she sat very still for a long time, holding her husband's hand, and that the room around her seemed to become very clear and very sharp, as if every object in it had been illuminated in a specific way. The coffee cups on the counter, the calendar on the wall, the window over the sink with the winter light coming through it. She said she noticed all of it, and she thought about Thomas, and she did not cry for a long time. Danny Buckingham was told by his parents, after Calvert had spoken with them. He was 12 years old, and he had known many things over the previous 16 months, that this was what the truth was going to be. He went to his room. He sat on his bed. He thought about his brother showing him a new chord on the guitar and laughing about it, and he let himself cry in a way he had not allowed himself to cry before, because before there had been a reason to hold it back, and now there wasn't. Donna Shirley said that when Calvert told her, she thought first of all things about Michael's sketchbook. She thought about all the drawings in it, all the things Michael had recorded in his own private visual language. She had the sketchbook still. She had kept it. She thought about how it was full of things he had seen, and how the last pages of it were blank, and how they would always be blank now, how there were no more things to draw. Gerald Howell was in New Mexico when the remains were found. He was notified of the discovery through law enforcement channels. Not because investigators were required to notify him, but because the notification served a purpose. Because when a person who carrying a secret learns that the thing they buried has been found, their response to that information is itself information. The detective in New Mexico who delivered the notification to Howell, a coordinated action with Calvert's knowledge and direction, later reported that Howell had received it in silence, had said nothing for a long moment, and then had said, "Okay," one word. The word of a person who had been waiting for something, and had just been told it had arrived. He had not asked how they were found. He had not asked who had found them. He had not said anything that an innocent man might say upon learning that 3 missing boys from his former neighborhood had been discovered dead. He had said, "Okay." And then he had closed the door. The arrest warrant was issued on December 11, 1975, 17 months after the disappearance of Thomas Simmons, Charles Buckingham, and Michael Shirley. It was issued in connection with their deaths, 3 counts of murder in the first degree. It was based on the accumulated weight of the entire investigation, the eyewitness testimony, the forensic evidence from the garage, the behavioral pattern, Danny Buckingham's account of the spring conversations, the discovery of the remains on the property where Howell had worked, the ring identified by Donna Shirley, and the totality of everything that Roy Calvert had spent 17 months assembling with patience and with stubbornness and with the particular commitment of a person who had looked at the photographs of 3 boys on his office wall every single day and refused to look away. 2 New Mexico deputies accompanied by a Fort Worth detective arrested Gerald Howell at his rented room on December 14, 1975. He was brought to the door, and the warrant was presented, and he was told he was under arrest for the murders of Thomas Simmons, Charles Buckingham, and Michael Shirley. Howell looked at the warrant. He looked at the detective. His face was, as it had always been, unreadable in its ordinary expressions. But the detective present, who was not Roy Calvert, who had arrived separately and was waiting at the local law enforcement facility where Howell would be processed before extradition, later said that in the moment the handcuffs were applied, something happened to Howell's body that was not about his face at all. His shoulders dropped. Not dramatically, not the way a man who collapses in theatrical fashion, just slightly. A slight release of tension that had been held for a very long time, as if some part of him had been waiting for this too. He was extradited to Fort Worth in January of 1976. The drive back through the Texas landscape, New Mexico to West Texas back to Fort Worth, the landscape reversing itself, the horizon drawing closer, the city reassembling itself in the distance, was made in the custody of 2 Tarrant County detectives. Roy Calvert was not among them. Calvert had chosen not to be. He had made his arrests across his career with the professional detachment that the work requires. But this particular man in this particular vehicle, being brought back to the city where 3 boys had lived and died, this one he chose to receive at the destination, rather than accompany on the journey. He was standing in the facility when the transport arrived. He watched Howell come through the doors in custody, and for a moment the 2 men looked at each other across the room. The same look they had exchanged in a rented room in West Texas 4 months earlier, and in a Fort Worth interview room a year before that. The long, specific, complicated look of 2 people who have been circling each other through the terrain of one case for 17 months. Howell looked away first. Calvert went back to his office. He sat at his desk. He looked at the photographs of Thomas and Charles and Michael on the wall, the school photographs, the flat lighting, the slightly uncertain expressions, the 3 boys who had not yet known what was coming. He sat with them for a while. He thought about what had been found in November, and what it had taken to find it, and what it meant for the families that it had been found. He thought about the fact that finding it, and bringing the person responsible for it into custody, was not the same thing as justice, and not the same thing as healing, and not the same thing as giving 3 families back what they had lost, because nothing could be those things. He understood that. He had always understood it, but it was something. It was the thing he had been able to do. It was the fullest extent of what the law in his own capacity, and 17 months of patient, stubborn, committed work had allowed him to achieve. He picked up the phone. He called Patricia Simmons. He told her that Gerald Howell was in custody in Fort Worth. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Thank you, Roy." The trial of Gerald Howell for the murders of Thomas Simmons, Charles Buckingham, and Michael Shirley was set for the fall of 1976. Between his arrival in Fort Worth in January and the beginning of proceedings in September, there were 9 months of legal preparation. 9 months during which the machinery of the justice system moved at its own pace in its own language, according to its own rules. And the families of the 3 boys waited inside that machinery the way people wait inside any system that is larger than them and moves slower than their grief. The Tarrant County District Attorney who would prosecute the case was a man named Philip Garrett. He was in his early 40s, a career prosecutor who had handled serious felonies for most of his professional life and who understood, with the clarity that experience provides, both what the evidence in this case could do for him and what it could not. He had a strong circumstantial case. He had the forensic evidence from the garage, the eyewitness testimony of Arthur Lemon, Danny Buckingham's account of the spring conversations, the discovery of the remains on the property where Howell had worked, the ring identified by Donna Shirley. He had the behavioral pattern documented across 3 neighborhoods and 2 states. He had Roy Calvert, who was going to be a formidable witness, patient, precise, comprehensive. The kind of investigator whose testimony juries tend to find credible because the credibility is earned rather than performed. What he did not have was a confession. He did not have a single witness who had seen Gerald Howell commit any act of violence against any of the 3 boys. He did not have physical evidence from the rural property that could be definitively linked to Howell. The remains had been found there, but the passage of 16 months had eliminated most of the forensic traces that might have directly connected a specific person to their placement. He did not have the kind of smoking gun, irrefutable, beyond any doubt evidence that makes a prosecutor's life considerably simpler. What he had was a case built from many pieces, each of which pointed in the same direction, none of which was individually conclusive, all of which, taken together, told a story that he believed, and that Roy Calvert believed, and that the families believed, was the true story of what had happened to 3 boys on a summer evening in Fort Worth in 1974. Whether a jury would believe it too was the question that would define the next several months. Gerald Howell's defense attorney was a man named Warren Stiles, who had been practicing criminal defense law in Fort Worth for 15 years and who was, by the professional assessment of most people in the legal community who knew him, very good at his job. He was not a showy attorney. He did not perform for the courtroom in the theatrical way that some defense lawyers do, the way that makes for compelling television, but sometimes alienates the very juries it's trying to persuade. He was quiet and methodical, and he had a quality of attention that mirrored, in some respects, the quality that Roy Calvert brought to investigation. He paid close attention to everything, missed very little, and waited for the precise moment to apply pressure in the precise place where it would be most effective. He had several things to work with. The absence of a confession was significant. A jury instructed to presume innocence would have to be persuaded that the circumstantial evidence was sufficient to overcome that presumption, and Stiles's job was to keep that threshold as high as possible in the jury's mind. The blood evidence from the garage was type O, which proved nothing specific. The eyewitness, Arthur Lemon, had seen a man from a moving vehicle in poor lighting conditions 4 months before coming forward. Stiles would make Lemon's identification as uncertain as possible, would press on the delay, would press on every gap and qualification in his account. Danny Buckingham's testimony was from a 12-year-old boy recounting something he had overheard 18 months earlier. Stiles would approach it with the gentleness that the situation of a grieving child required, but he would nonetheless test its reliability. The ring could not be definitively identified. The connection between Howell and the rural property was established but not exclusive. Other people had also worked on that property over the years. He would not, Stiles decided, mount a defense that argued someone else had done this. He would not introduce alternative suspects or alternative theories, because doing so would shift the burden of persuasion in a direction that risked the jury's sympathy and trust. Instead, his defense would be focused, relentless, and simple. The prosecution had not proven its case. The evidence pointed, yes, but pointing was not proving. And in a system built on the presumption of innocence, pointing was not enough. The trial began on September 13, 1976, in Tarrant County District Court. The courtroom was full from the first day, filled with members of the community, with press, with people who had followed the case from the beginning, and who understood its significance in the life of the neighborhood and the city. The families of the three boys were present every day. Patricia Simmons and her husband sat together, straight-backed, with the particular dignity of people who have decided that whatever happens in this room, they will face it upright. Donna Shirley sat with members of her extended family on either side of her, the kind of physical presence of people who understand that sometimes the body needs to be held up by the bodies of others. Danny Buckingham, now 13, sat with his parents and watched the proceedings with eyes that were older than his age, in ways that were visible from across the room. Gerald Howell sat at the defense table with Warren Stiles. He was dressed in a dark suit that did not quite fit him correctly, the shoulders too narrow for his frame, the sleeves slightly too short. He sat upright and looked forward, and his expression was, as it had always been, the same opaque, self-contained thing that gave nothing away. People in the courtroom who saw him for the first time that day remarked on it later, on the quality of his stillness, on the way he seemed to occupy the room without responding to it, the way an object occupies a room rather than the way a person does. Philip Garrett's opening statement was careful and methodical. He laid out the story of the disappearance, the investigation, the evidence, the discovery of the remains. He told the jury what he intended to prove, and he told it in a voice that was measured and serious and devoid of any attempt at theatrical effect, because theatrical effect was not what this case needed. What it needed was the weight of the truth, presented plainly, allowed to rest in the jury's attention without ornamentation. Warren Stiles's opening statement was shorter and equally direct. He told the jury that the prosecution was going to present a great deal of circumstantial evidence, and that when they had heard all of it, they were going to find that it pointed in a direction without arriving at a destination. He told them that his client was entitled to the presumption of innocence, that this was not a courtesy or a technicality, but the foundational principle of the system of justice they were all participating in. He told them that reasonable doubt was not merely a phrase but a standard, and that the prosecution's evidence, however extensive, did not meet it. The jury listened. 14 people, 12 jurors and 2 alternates, who had been selected over 2 days of voir dire, who had been questioned about their ability to be fair, who had sworn to render a verdict based on the evidence and nothing else. They sat in their box and listened, and the trial began. Roy Calvert took the stand on the 3rd day of the trial. He was on the stand for 2 full days, Garrett's direct examination on the 3rd day, Stiles's cross-examination on the 4th. In those 2 days, the entire investigation was laid before the jury in the most complete and detailed form it had yet been presented. Calvert was, as the people who knew him would have predicted, an exceptional witness. He was precise. He was organized. He spoke in a way that was clear and accessible without being simplified, that respected the jury's intelligence without overwhelming it. He described every step of the investigation in sequence: the initial disappearance report, the canvassing, the witness accounts, the first interview with Howell, Beverly Estes' call, the search warrant, the garage, the luminol, the blood evidence, the ring, Danny Buckingham's account, the West Texas incident, the New Mexico arrest, the discovery of the remains. He told it like a story because it was a story, and he had spent 25 months living inside it. Stiles's cross-examination pressed on every weak point with the thoroughness and precision that his reputation promised. He pressed on the blood evidence, type O, consistent with almost half the population, not exclusively consistent with any of the 3 boys. He pressed on the eyewitness identification, Arthur Lemond, a moving vehicle, poor light, 4 months delay, a partial identification made with explicit uncertainty. He pressed on the ring, Donna Shirley's belief, not her certainty, a simple ring of a type that was not unique. He pressed on the connection between Howell and the rural property, established but not exclusive. Other workers on the same land, no direct physical evidence placing Howell at the site of the remains. He pressed on everything, and Calvert answered everything. And the picture that emerged from those 2 days was the full picture of the case in all its complexity. The strength of it and the limitations of it, both on equal display. At the end of Stiles's cross-examination, he asked Calvert a question that the courtroom remembered for a long time afterward. He asked Detective Calvert, in the 25 months you have spent investigating this case, did Gerald Howell ever say anything to you that constituted an admission of guilt? Calvert looked at Stiles for a moment, and then he said, not in words. Stiles said, I'm sorry. Calvert said, in words, no. He never admitted anything in words. The pause after that answer was about 3 seconds long. It was one of the most significant 3 seconds of the entire trial. Stiles moved on. But those 3 seconds stayed in the room. Arthur Lemon testified on the 5th day. He was visibly nervous. A middle-aged insurance salesman in a suit that fit him better than Howell's fit Howell. His hands clasped in front of him. His eyes moving between Garrett and the jury with the focused attention of a person who understands the weight of what he is being asked to do. He described the evening of July 12, 1974, the drive east. The truck pulled to the side of the road. The boys, the man, the look that had followed his car as he passed. He described the 4 months he had spent trying to convince himself it was nothing, and the moment he had finally understood he could not keep convincing himself, and had gone to the police. He described the photograph array. He described seeing Gerald Howell's photograph and what he had felt when he saw it. He said, under oath, with the careful precision of a person who understands what precision means in this context, that Gerald Howell looked like the man he had seen near that truck on that road on that evening, that he believed it was him, that he could not be absolutely certain, because the conditions had been what they were, but that his honest belief, formed in the moment and sustained over the 2 years since, was that the man in the photograph was the man at the road. Stiles's cross-examination of Lemon was the most aggressive portion of his defense, not aggressive in tone, because Stiles was too skilled to be aggressive in tone, with a witness who was clearly trying to do the right thing, but aggressive in the precision of its challenge. He walked Lemon through the conditions second by second, the speed of a moving vehicle, the duration of the visual contact, the quality of the available light, the distance between Lemon's car and the truck. He established, through methodical questioning, that Lemon had been traveling at speed, that his observation had lasted only a handful of seconds, that the light had been described by multiple other witnesses as poor, and that Lemon's ability to identify a face under those conditions was, at minimum, open to serious question. Lemon held up better than many witnesses hold up under that kind of examination. He did not retreat from his identification. He did not suddenly become uncertain when pressed, in the way that less honest witnesses sometimes do under pressure. He maintained, consistently and calmly, that he believed the man in the photograph was the man he had seen, and that he understood the limitations of his observation, and was not claiming more certainty than he had. It was honest testimony. The jury could see that it was honest. Whether they found it sufficient was another question. Danny Buckingham's testimony was the most difficult moment of the trial for everyone in the courtroom. He was 13 years old when he took the stand. He had been prepared carefully by the prosecution, not coached in the sense of being told what to say, but supported, in the sense of being helped to understand what the process would feel like and how to navigate it. He sat in the witness chair in a jacket that his mother had ironed that morning, and he looked at the courtroom and he answered the questions. Garrett led him through it gently. The spring of 1974. The times he had seen talking to Charles and Thomas. The conversation he had overheard, the offer of work, the property east of the city, the money, the assurance that their friend would be there too. He told it clearly, in the direct and straightforward way that children sometimes tell things when they have been holding the telling in for a long time, and the relief of finally saying it outright lends their words a particular clarity. Stiles chose not to cross-examine Danny Buckingham. It was the right decision both strategically and humanly. There was nothing to be gained, legally, practically, or in the eyes of the jury, from subjecting a 13-year-old boy who had just described the last conversation he ever overheard his brother have to an adversarial examination. Stiles stood and said quietly that he had no questions for this witness, and the courtroom was very still for a moment. Danny stepped down from the stand and walked back to where his parents were sitting. His mother put her arm around him. He looked straight ahead and did not look at the defense table, where Gerald Howell was sitting, and where Howell was also looking straight ahead, and the distance between them across that room was about 30 feet, and about 2 years and about everything. The forensic evidence was presented through expert witnesses, a forensic specialist from the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office, a bloodstain pattern analyst, a specialist in soreanalysis who had examined the area around the remains. Their testimony was technical and dense and necessary, and it established several things that were significant. The luminol results in the garage, and what they indicated about the quantity of blood that had been present. The blood typing results and what they could and could not establish. The condition of the remains as found, and what could be determined from their condition. The forensic assessment that the remains had been placed at the site, rather than having arrived there by any other means. What the forensic experts could not establish, and Stiles made certain the jury understood this clearly, was a direct, unbroken chain of physical evidence linking Gerald Howell to any of those findings. The blood in the garage could not be identified as belonging to any specific individual. The remains could not yield from the forensic methods available in 1976 any evidence that identified who had placed them there. The physical world had not preserved, in the specific forms that could be conclusively presented to a jury, the absolute proof that the investigation had been building toward for 2 years. Garrett rested the prosecution's case after 12 days of testimony. The picture he had painted was comprehensive, coherent, and consistent. It was a portrait of guilt assembled from many strokes, none of which was alone sufficient, all of which together created something unmistakable. Stiles presented his defense over 4 days. He called character witnesses, people who had worked with Howell, who described him as reliable, unremarkable, ordinary. He called an expert who testified about the limitations of eyewitness memory, the specific conditions under which identification becomes unreliable, the ways in which the mind fills gaps in perception with expectation rather than observation. He called a retired investigator who offered an opinion that the investigation had developed tunnel vision, had settled on Howell early and organized its subsequent findings around him, rather than pursuing all possible explanations with equal vigor. And then, on the last day of the defense case, something happened that nobody in the courtroom had anticipated. Warren Stiles called Gerald Howell to the stand. This was a decision that surprised the prosecution, that surprised the court, and surprised the people who filled the gallery every day. A defendant in a criminal trial has the absolute right not to testify, and exercising that right cannot be held against them. The jury is instructed explicitly not to draw negative inferences from a defendant's silence. Most defense attorneys, in cases built primarily on circumstantial evidence, advise their clients not to testify. The risks are significant. A defendant on the stand is subject to cross-examination, and cross-examination in the hands of a skilled prosecutor is one of the most effective tools in the legal arsenal. Calvert had spent 25 months getting to know every aspect of this case and every aspect of Gerald Howell's life. The opportunity to question Howell directly under oath in a courtroom was not one that Garrett would squander. So why had Stiles made this choice? The answer, which became clear as Howell's testimony progressed, was that Stiles had made a calculation. His defense was built on reasonable doubt, on the insufficiency of the prosecution's evidence. And he had concluded that the most powerful version of that argument was not the one delivered through expert witnesses and legal reasoning, but the one delivered by Gerald Howell himself, sitting in the witness chair, looking at the jury, and denying what had been alleged against him. He had concluded, perhaps not that Howell's particular quality of stillness, his composure, his flat and opaque delivery, would read not as guilt but as innocence. That a jury looking at this man, hearing this man, would find it possible to believe that he was simply what he said. He was an ordinary man who had been caught in the terrible gears of a circumstantial case, and was paying for something he had not done. It was a gamble. It was the kind of gamble that defines trials. Howell took the stand. He was sworn in. He sat in the witness chair with his large hands in his lap, and he looked at his attorney and waited for the first question. Stiles led him through his life in broad strokes, his background, his work history, his time in Fort Worth, his connection to the neighborhoods in question. Howell answered in the same minimal, factual way he answered everything. He confirmed that he had known the area where the boys had lived. He confirmed that he might have spoken to teenagers in the neighborhood, in the way that any adult living in a neighborhood speaks to the young people around them, without significance. He confirmed that he had owned the dark blue truck. He confirmed the alibi, the bar, the evening of July 12th, the two witnesses who had confirmed his presence. He addressed the garage he worked on his truck. He cut himself regularly. He could not account for the extent of what the luminol had found, but he maintained that blood in a garage was not unusual, and that he had no explanation beyond that. He addressed the property east of the city. He had worked there. He was familiar with it. He denied any knowledge of the remains that had been found there. And then, in response to the final question, Stiles asked him, "Did you kill Thomas Simmons, Charles Buckingham, and Michael Shirley?" Gerald Howell looked at the jury and said, in a voice that was exactly as flat and exactly as controlled as it had always been, "No." He said it once. He did not elaborate. He looked at the jury as he said it, and then he looked back at his attorney, and the direct examination was over. Philip Garrett rose for cross-examination. What followed was 2.5 hours that the people present in that courtroom described, in the various accounts they gave over the subsequent years, in remarkably consistent terms. Not as a dramatic breakdown, not as a Perry Mason moment where the guilty man cracks under pressure and confesses in front of the jury. It was nothing like that, and to describe it as anything like that would be dishonest. What it was something quieter and in many ways more revealing. A 2.5-hour conversation between a prosecutor who knew every detail of every piece of evidence assembled against this man, and a defendant who had spent 2 years maintaining the same story against all pressure, and who was now maintaining it under oath while the people who had loved the boys he had killed sat 30 feet away and watched. Garrett moved through the evidence methodically. He did not rush. He gave each element of the case its full weight and asked Howell to account for it, specifically and in detail. The truck and the road, the timing, the alibi witness who had moved away and could not be found, the luminol results and the extent of them, the ring, the spring conversations, the West Texas incident, the teenager, the truck, the 2 encounters, the formal complaint, the move to New Mexico, the single word, "okay," that Howell had said when he was notified that the remains had been found. Each one in sequence, given its full weight and placed before the jury with the question, "Explain this. Account for this. Tell us what this means." Howell answered. He answered everything. He maintained his denials and his alternate explanations with the same consistency he had maintained them across 2 years and multiple interviews. He was, as a witness, exactly what Stiles had bet he would be, composed, controlled, giving nothing away, sounding, if you listen to the words alone, like a man who was telling the truth. But Garrett was not just building a legal case in those 2.5 hours. He was doing something else simultaneously. Something that became clear only when he reached the last part of his cross-examination, when he moved away from the specific evidence and asked Howell a different kind of question entirely. He asked Howell about the boys, not about the evidence, not about the investigation, about Thomas Simmons and Charles Buckingham and Michael Shirley as people. What did he know about them? Had he ever spoken to them? Did he know what kind of people they had been? Howell said he didn't really know them. Said they were just kids from the neighborhood. He might have seen them around. He couldn't say specifically. Garrett let that sit for a moment, and then he said, "Mr. Howell, Thomas Simmons was saving up for his first car. Did you know that? Howell said he did not. Garrett said. Charles Buchan was teaching himself guitar. He'd just learned a new chord he was proud of. Did you know that? Howell said. Garrett said. Michael Shirley kept a sketchbook. He drew everything he saw. He carried it with him almost everywhere. Did you know that? Howell said he did not. Garrett said, their mothers are in this courtroom right now. They've been here every day of this trial. Did you know that? There was a silence, and Gerald Howell, for the first time in any context in the 2 years that this case had been developing, looked away from the person who was speaking to him. He looked away from Garrett. He looked down at his hands in his lap, and it lasted only a few seconds. He looked back up. He said yes, he was aware of that. His voice was exactly the same as it had always been. But the jury had seen it. The families had seen it. And Roy Calvert, sitting in the gallery that day, had seen it too. He had seen it, and he had thought about all the times he had sat across from this man and watched those eyes, and all the small things he had noted and filed away, and he thought that what he had just watched was the closest Gerald Howell was ever come to acknowledging what he had done. Not in words, but there. Closing arguments were delivered on the 21st day of the trial. Garrett went first, as the prosecution does, and his closing was the fullest expression of the case he had built. Not just the legal argument, but the human one. The argument that said, look at these 3 boys, look at the families who loved them. Look at this man and what the evidence tells you about him, and render the verdict that the truth requires. He was not bombastic. He was not performative. He was simply present with the weight of it, and he asked the jury to be present with it too. Stiles's closing was a precise and disciplined argument about reasonable doubt, about the standard, about what it means, about why it exists, about the danger of convicting a man on circumstantial evidence because you feel in your gut that he is guilty. He said the prosecution had feelings. He said the prosecution had a compelling narrative. He said the prosecution had a case built from many pieces, each of which had its own limitations, none of which were conclusive. He said that feeling certain and being certain beyond a reasonable doubt were not the same thing, and that the law required the latter, not the former. It was a good argument. It was an honest argument. It was the argument that the evidence permitted. The jury deliberated for 3 days, 3 days in which the families waited. 3 days in which Roy Calvert went to his office and did his work, because the work of a detective does not stop while juries deliberate, but could not, in any meaningful way, attend to anything other than the room where 12 people were deciding what 2 years of his life had been for. 3 days in which the courtroom sat empty between sessions, and the hallways of the courthouse held the families and the press, held the community members who had come to witness, who had come because they understood that what was being decided here was about more than one man's fate. It was about the 3 boys and the 2 years and the grief that had been accumulating in a Fort Worth neighborhood since a summer evening in 1974. The verdict came back on a Thursday afternoon. The jury found Gerald Howell guilty of 3 counts of murder in the first degree. The reaction in the courtroom when the verdict was read was not the explosion of sound that is sometimes depicted in dramatizations of such moments. It was something quieter and considerably more complicated than that. There were people who cried. There were people who closed their eyes. There were people who put their arms around the people next to them and simply held on. Patricia Simmons, by her own later account, felt something she struggled to name. It was not relief exactly, because relief suggests the restoration of something that was there before, and what was there before was Thomas, and Thomas was not restored. It was not happiness for the same reason. It was something different, the specific and terrible satisfaction of the truth being formally acknowledged, of the legal system doing the thing the legal system exists to do, of the name of the thing that had happened being spoken aloud in a room built for that purpose, with the full weight of the law behind it. She said she thought they know now. The world knows now what happened to my son. Donna Shirley said that when the verdict was read, she looked at her hands in her lap and thought about Michael's sketchbook. still sitting on a shelf in his room. She had kept it there, had kept his room as it was, in the way that grieving parents sometimes do. She thought about the blank pages at the end of it. She thought about how the blank pages were still blank, and always would be, and that this verdict did not fill them. But it was something. It was the fullest extent of what was possible. Gerald Howell, when the verdict was read, showed nothing. He sat at the defense table with his hands flat on the surface in front of him, and his face in its customary arrangement, and he received the verdict of the jury the way he received everything, in silence. In that opaque and impenetrable stillness. He was sentenced 3 weeks later to 3 consecutive life terms in the Texas state prison system, with no possibility of parole. He was taken from the courtroom in handcuffs and he did not look back. Gerald Howell died in a Texas state prison in 2001, 25 years into his sentence. He never confessed. He never spoke publicly about what he had done. He took whatever words he had left to say with him into silence, and the silence held. Roy Calvert retired from the Fort Worth Police Department in 1989. He kept the photographs of Thomas, Charles, and Michael on his wall until the day he left. The 3 families never fully healed. You don't fully heal from something like this. You carry it. You learn to carry it in ways that allow you to keep living, keep breathing, keep getting up in the morning. But you carry it, Patricia Simmons said, in an interview given years after the trial, that she still talks to Thomas sometimes. In the quiet of the house, in the early morning, she tells him she loves him. She doesn't know if he hears her. She does it anyway. Thomas Simmons was 16 years old. Charles Buckingham was 16. Michael Shirley was 15. They deserved their whole lives. Thank you for listening tonight. Please subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Good night, and stay safe.